Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Sorry for the delay in getting this started. Make sure to take a moment and like, share, subscribe, um, you know, support the Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Um, Today, we're going to talk about part 4 or chapter 4 of Cedric Robinson's Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. I'll just plug a couple of things that are coming up. I forgot the date, but I got to figure that out. But I'm currently reading Garrett Felber's long-awaited biography of Martin Sostre, A Continuous Struggle. Looking forward to that. I should say currently, I need to get into reading it. I've been reading reading this currently, but looking forward to that. I've been looking forward to that book for quite a while, and I'm sure it's going to be a really excellent read. Other thing too is if you haven't checked it out yet, there's a 2-part conversation with Andrew Crinks on this book. Really good stuff. And there's a few other things that are coming out. I think I'll be putting something up that Josh did, an interview with Daryl Lee. We'll probably put that up later today on the audio side. So anyway, just trying to keep busy. A lot of stuff coming out. Also, just want to say I saw this morning that Ali Abanima from Electronic Intifada had been arrested in Switzerland. I just want to say, obviously, solidarity with him. Hopefully that will take care of itself pretty quickly, but also just huge, hugely indebted, I guess is the best way to say it, to his work and to the work of all the people at Electronic Intifada for decades now, but especially over, the last 16 months or so during, the genocide and, all their work. Shout out to all of them. And so, and also I should say, other than journalists in Gaza, who obviously, and in Lebanon, and where we've seen hundreds of them be killed by the Zionist entity, I don't think in the West there's anybody that um, you know compares to the work that they have done on Palestine. So just big shout out to them, and solidarity to Ali. All right, let's get into it. So I'm going to bring our guest, Mtume Gant, writer, director, filmmaker, scholar, and almost or potential Oscar Micheaux biopic. Well, I don't know if it was a biopic, but yeah. So let's start with this story. So, because just for context, this chapter that we're talking about today, it does a lot of things that a lot of the other ones do in terms of providing a lot of political economy and analysis of the film industry in the period and tying in a lot of the threads from earlier chapters into this period. The film Within Our Gates that he's talking about, I'm not actually 100% clear if it's 1919 or 1920, but maybe 1920. But in that period, it comes out. Amazing film, by the way. I mean, I put a link to it in the show description. My only quibble, aside from the fact that it was recovered in Spain and like all the intertitles are recreated, and there's some gaps in it that he talks about in the chapter, but my only quibble is that there's no soundtrack on the Library of Congress version. I know that soundtracking came later, this is why silent film, but a little music, music was typical, which is something also that Robinson talks about in this chapter. And so to be totally silent without music, I think takes away from the viewing experience a little bit, but nonetheless, incredible film, really. So anyways, we talked about, I just for the audience, I didn't know this prior to us starting this project, that you had been trying to get a film made on Oscar Micheaux. So tell that story.
So first of all, peace everybody. Good to see folks and be here on Sunday. So this is I'm gonna get the year messed up. It's either 2015 or 2016. I think it was 2015 though. In 2015, I had met a filmmaker that many people will probably know named Ronaldo Marcus Green. If people know his name is he's the director of King Richard, the Richard Williams movie, and the most recent Bob Marley film also. And I met Ray, gosh, like when I think he was just leaving NYU. We met at a film festival. He hadn't even done his first film, Monsters and Men, yet. And we met at a film festival. We had both screened at the Aspen Shorts Fest, and I think I saw him at a few other festivals with my film Spit. It was just kind of like, it's one of these things that happen when you're touring a film in a festival circuit. You end up like seeing the same filmmakers over and over again, and you end up like, in these rooms together. So you develop relationships or, intrigues. And we didn't necessarily like, like we're like hanging out, but like I was with him a lot. And then later that year or early the next year, I can't remember exactly, he sent me an email and he was like, "Hey, I have this project that they want to do these series of short films about famous Black, like, people, right? And would you be willing to kind of put your hat into it?" And I was like, sure, why not? And the person who was curating it was Karen Parsons, Hillary from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And I was like, okay, for sure. So I went back. I'm not a big fan of the biopic thing. It's never been a thing that's really interested me, to be perfectly honest with you. I've always been kind of like, about it. So I kind of stepped back and I was like, well, what could be interesting? And the parameter they had was like important Black people, things like that. And I figured I knew they would get, certain typical people be thrown out there. So I was like, wait a minute, if I'm gonna do a film about an important Black person, why not do Oscar Micheaux? I was like, to me, it was like the no-brainer person to do, right? And I had previously read a lot about Micheaux, coincidentally. And not that I ever wanted to do a film on him as much as like I'd always wondered about his contributions. I mean, I partly wish I would have found this book back then. I wish I would have known, but I was curious about his contributions and his style and his, his methodologies as we were trying to kind of develop a real, idea of what like Black film culture is, which I think we'll probably actually get into today in conversation. So I wrote this piece and I said, you know what? I actually want to focus it on his creation of Within Our Gates. I was like, yo, we'll just do that. It'll be like a 20-minute film and it'll just like talk about the creation of it. We could talk about Birth of a Nation and all these things. And like, I wrote this like proposal, right? And like, is it the best proposal ever written? I'm not sure, but like the idea was just like, to me, was just like home run. It was Hank Aaron out the park. I was like, this is the idea. And I gave it to Ray, and Ray was like, "This is dope." He was like, "Yeah, this is. I think this is a good one." So I met with Karen Parsons, very nice woman, but I will say she didn't really see it the same way that I did. She was actually a little miffed, and she actually wasn't that familiar with Micheaux, which then sent me on an interesting journey because I then asked several people that I knew, like coincidentally, like what do they know about Oscar Micheaux? And then I realized that his name is kind of known, but his films are not really engaged with. He feels like prehistory for Black film, for Black cinema. There's been efforts to kind of make him like history, but like he's just kept in this kind of proto area that I find to be a little weird. And when I was having this conversation with Kara Parsons, it was like, pitching, I was like, we should do this. The vibe was definitely not like, it was like, oh, interesting idea, but like, not really, right? I don't really think this is like the one that we want to do, right? And I got the sense, didn't tell me like right then, but I got the sense as I was in the meeting, I remember like this is not gonna fly. And I waited a little bit, and they told me, they were like, "Well, we think this is an interesting pitch, but we just don't think." I mean, they said a phrase, and I can't remember exactly what it was. I tried to look at my email, see if I still had it, probably in an old email or like put somewhere. I can't find it. But the phrase was something akin to, you know, these other people that we selected, as far as like the historical Black people, have more traction.
Yeah.
And I found that really weird. And it's funny. I did float, actually trying to do it on my own though. Later,
Mhm.
I never got to it. But I did float the idea, trying to do it again. But after a couple of years, I think I kind of gave up on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, I mean, I had a great professor in undergrad, Patrick Rail, really good historian. And he taught a bunch of stuff, but one of the classes that he taught an African American film class pre-civil rights. I think it was like 1965, I think was the cutoff year for him or something like that. Um, and Micheaux was the most important figure in this class, which I think speaks positively to who my professor was and his politics and stuff like that. The book that we read primarily was Bowser and Spence. So this is where, like, I think I'm actually like, maybe we read a little bit of a something from Robinson, but it definitely was not this chapter. Um, and that was clarified to me as I was reading it, and then I was getting all the references to Bowser and Spence. I'm like, oh yeah, this is where this was our main text. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think it's also fascinating in the way that our culture, U.S. popular culture loves to celebrate Black firsts. He is, I mean, even the Library of Congress version, one of the things that they put on like the pre-titles or whatever of the film is like, this is the first, like the oldest preserved, basically Black directed film, full length, I think is probably what they're talking about. But, um, and so, I think that his politics have to also cause problems for people, like the criticisms that he has of both the society, but also of certain characters, which we'll get into, of like like the preacher. And um there's just there's really interesting politics within this film. And I think it's funny to watch. I rewatched it again last night, um, because you're watching it and it almost feels like this couldn't have been, your brain is kind of doing this, like, this couldn't have been the first Black film that's preserved. Like, there had to be, like, because it's so good and the criticisms within it are so strong that it seems anachronistic to a certain point to how we understand early representations of Black film, and
Mm-hmm.
even like sort of like what I guess you call Black self-representation within this period, right? Um, and so I know we'll get to that further down the line. It's further along. It's sort of where Robinson kind of closes this long chapter. This is like 100-page chapter that we did. I read it twice, so I feel like I read a big book for this discussion. And it was hard to take notes on everything that was going on in this chapter, which I know was a struggle for both of us. But yeah, I just find it is interesting in that sense. Like, I definitely wouldn't say, it's very interesting to me for somebody to put him outside of the history, or to say like, he's kind of not big enough or not important enough, when there's so much celebration of other figures. But I think that it also speaks to, yeah, that like there's certain, class interests or class alignments that he's pointing to in the film that are uncomfortable for a lot of people who would be today's filmmakers in
Right.
certain ways.
Yeah. No, I think that's the key point. I think, not to go too much into this, but there is a reference point that I think many people in like Black Hollywood or the adjacent or the ones who want to get there, they have a reference point that I think is more comfortable for them, and that's like certain types of films of a certain type of representation with certain types of like famous figures, right? Rather than, and I think Michaud's like interventions don't really have a lot of traction for them, and they just keep it as like a nice piece of history, but I almost feel like not that they would want it to go away, but my part of me thinks like if it like withered away, they wouldn't really mind, right? Oh yeah, that's interesting too. Or they take it out there. I did see someone break it out their pocket, but it's one of these like black capitalist Hollywood people. Well, Lincoln Motion Picture Company. We had our, they use it for that kind of thing, but for the actual creative works, the actual cinematic works, now they rather ignore it. But that's the thing. Maybe we can get into the last chapter, and it might actually come up a little bit, I think, in a little bit, just about the mentalities around what black film is and the kind of the traditional links.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's first of all, he was also a novelist. And interestingly, as they reconstructed the inner titles, they pulled from some of his written work
Yeah.
to try to do that, which is a shame, because what they have is a version that was found in Spain that had inner titles in Spanish, but of course those were not the original, so those were a translation of English. So they had to try to translate them back into English, but then of course because they're also using like dialect and stuff like that, it's complicated, and I think there's a little bit that's lost in translation with the film, but the overarching messages are pretty clear just by the visual representations on the screen and everything. All right, so let's start where he starts, which is with a whole bunch of kind of political economy and weaving these threads from previous chapters in. The first section is called Jim Crow, American Capitalism and the Motion Picture Industry. Yeah, what, you want to start us off?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things he says, I'll just read it like the first like 2 or 3 lines that he says, I think is really
Yep.
interesting. He says the commercial exploitation of motion pictures beginning in the last decade of the 19th century coincided exactly with the onset of Jim Crow, the judicial and legislative regimes of racial segregation. The coincidence of the manufacture of an embryonic mass culture and a profound restructuring of race relations serves as one critical rationale for the transfer of blackface minstrelsy and other icons of black inferiorization to the emerging filmic culture. So this is something that I think Robinson has been doing throughout the book, is kind of showing the confluence of the material development of the United States, which is then goes into like technology. And I think commercial exploitation is a really key word, right? This is something that, and I've been grateful for Robinson for really putting this into my brain, that film from the beginning was a commercial project, and he criticizes this a little bit here, and or throughout the book in general, where he says that people want to make film this kind of artistic thing. These great people just came together and made a great piece of art, and look at this. But no, it actually had real commercial needs. But then you coincide that with the creation of Jim Crow, right? And the fact that you needed to kind of create these regimes based on legislation and all of that, they're going to marry, and you're going to see the kind of wedding between these two factors and how they essentially serendipitously help each other. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that part.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting too that he does this thing throughout this section, which you probably were going to get to next, but it's like this. Even the next sentence after what you read, it's like most histories of the early American film industry adhere to the notion that the anarchy of production, distribution, exhibition, and content of films, which characterized the industry until 1908 or so, was brought to order by the logic of economics. But there's also compelling evidence to suggest that cohesion and control of American motion pictures was spurred by the powerful interests implicated in the formulation of the new racial regime. So this part, like, and he goes into more of this, but I think it's really important. And it's one of the things in Robinson that I think complicates his work for a lot of folks is, some of us might say that, and I think Robinson would too, that, I mean, because the idea of racial capitalism is that there's co-constitutive, uh, you know, and that racialization, kind of in Robinson's formulation precedes the development of capitalism and is used by the powerful elites. Um, but the interesting thing here is, like, I don't necessarily see economics and racial regimes as like two separate things to some, and I don't think Robinson wholly does either, but I think he sees them as like different processes that need to be attended to in conversation with each other, and like, so like part of what he does in this chapter is to show that like the railroads, which was also connected to all of the racist stuff that he's talked about in prior discussions, the World's Fairs, the support of like sort of blackface film and things like this, that they that the people who are heavily invested in them, he's showing, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more, how they are like, he goes into this whole thing on convict leasing and building the railroads, which is fascinating. So they're using these using very racist labor regimes and at the same time making very racist films. And I think what he's saying is that this is, I mean, one argument would be that's an economic thing that's going on there. But I think what he's saying is, like, you have to understand that there is a specific effort given into the cultural realm to create this racial regime that supports what you're doing in terms of a labor arrangement. And I think that that's an important thing to kind of look at how that happens. And so part of what he's pushing back against in terms of the economics thing, I think, is just the idea that the decisions made around film, some people might argue that they're all made from an economic lens. Like, this is the film that's going to make us the most money if we do X, Y, and Z. And what he's saying is, like, no, they're actually thinking more about what's going to make them more money in the railroad industry.
Yeah, because I think people have a trouble thinking of film of the older time. This is not Avengers. This is not, $200 million film trying to get $1 billion at the box office. This is new technology that they see as a supplement to their overall project. Maybe, like, did some, mogul think one day film could be this big thing? Sure, maybe, possible. I doubt it, but I'm sure it could be but that practically was not part of it. It was a supplement. And that's something that I believe tracks, because as Robinson has proved, and I think other people have proved, like Mark Cousins makes this point a lot, the film historian, about the idea that film and national cultures and trying to kind of talk about who you are nationalistically in this kind of rise of nations and then going into World War I, World War II, this becomes of uber importance. So I'm sure, when the Nazis were making all those films, were they making money? No, they were pouring it in because they needed to say something about their national project. And, it's going to cost money, and they were willing to take the hit. So And for them, and for what Robinson talks about here with the railroads and I think various other instances is that was the most important stuff. Like that was the key stuff to get out there. And film and imagery could help, uncomplicate or do a lot of different things that they needed done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we have to go through all of this, but he does say like the new racial regime would coalesce with American nationalism as the two
Yeah.
master narratives instituted to reassert political control over an American order frayed by domestic rebellion and social diversity. He then goes into like kind of all these sectors of capitalism. He talks about the financial capital which supported southern agriculture in the late 19th century no longer originated, he puts that in quotes, which is interesting, in London, but flowed from banks and investment houses in New York and Boston. Germany's predominance in machine production was being challenged by American firms. um, he also talks about how, despite massive unemployment among American workers, and perhaps because of long-term declines in wholesale prices, finance capital surveyed the globe for even more desperate and cheaper labor. And so he talks a lot about also, the surplus labor in the South, um, you know, and then he gets into like unions, the concerns around that. He also talks about black and white riverfront unions, and an interesting part where like within the railroads, like he talks about among firemen and brakemen and southern railroads, blacks retained their dominance inherited from the antebellum era when northern railroad brotherhoods of conductors, engineers, firemen, and brakemen barred blacks from these occupations. As late as 1900, an observer wrote, "It is an everyday occurrence in the South to see white locomotive engineers and colored firemen seated in the same cab." So really interesting stuff there, in terms of, just showing like we wouldn't think that, we would think, well, yeah, everything's segregated in the South by 1900. The idea that you would have, a white engineer and, the fireman in a train in that sense, the guy like shoveling coal into the engine would be
Mm-hmm.
a black man, so yeah, he gets into other aspects, but just these concerns around labor. Minor point, but he says in the New South, those whom John Sell characterizes as black and white peasants, but usually referred to as farmers in the parlance of other American historians, were edging towards class solidarity in the Farmers Alliance movement and some sectors of populism. The footnote there I found fascinating, which it says is a quote from John Sell, who wrote this book, Highest Stage of White Supremacy, I believe is what it's called. Says, everywhere in the world except in England and America, sharecroppers and small independent farmers are called peasants. And I just found that a great, like, Marxist intervention there. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, Sell, I'm assuming, is coming from a kind of Marxist tradition, but just to say, like, this is another one of those things. We have other euphemisms like this in America, where it's like everybody, everywhere else in the world, this is the peasantry. And in the United States, we have all these other terms, sharecroppers, independent farmers, like, so on.
It's always
That
fascinated
we,
me that we've never used that word too. I've always been fascinated by it, and I've never understood why not. And that's part of that's
yeah,
a good thought. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
and it does say this is what it goes on to quote from Sell. It says in the 1870s and more aggressively in the 1880s, organizations of white farmers and artisanal laborers amassed to challenge the nation's merchants, bankers, railroad corporations, and the like. Spawned from local circumstances rather than from national headquarters, they nevertheless achieved a formidable unity of purpose, the establishment of cooperative stores, purchasing initiatives, and cooperative markets for buying and selling of cotton and other produce, end quote. And so, yeah, just interesting. I mean, he looks at the populists movements in the 1890s, and so on, which, as he writes, had a kind of fusion with Republicans in the South and
Mm-hmm.
Democrats in the North. And it resorted in some political wins at a certain level. And but as he goes into with it, like, the white people in it didn't necessarily fight to stop segregation, even if they also didn't fight for it, is kind of what he's arguing, is that they, um, it's as John Sell suggests, many of the South's poor whites might have supported Black disenfranchisement. It is unlikely that they would have sacrificed themselves to the cause. In either case, quote, they lack the power, end quote, to protect themselves, much less choreograph attacks on Black voters. It was the planters who pursued and directed disenfranchisement. So anyway, just an interesting part too there of talking about, he always has this kind of swirl of, what are some of the different mass movements, the different challenges to the rule of capital that are going on in at the time that, you know, I think in his view direct the kind of interventions they're making in the propaganda realm, I guess, if we use that term.
Mm-hmm. One other thing he does say that I want to throw in there, I think it ties as a little bit of a framing. He has this line where he says, "It is no exaggeration to suggest that from the 1890s to World War I, the country had no national political consensus, no hegemonic cultural core, no dominant historical identity, no definitive social solidarity." And I think that's really interesting because what he's then positing is that you're seeing, because he goes into to American nationalism, how the new racial regime will coalesce with it, like Jared had mentioned. So he's basically showing you really how the American kind of national project was solidified. And I have to say, I have to not to go too anecdotal. Many years ago, I wanted to pitch a television show when I was still trying to do Hollywood stuff that actually would have taken place right at the beginning of World War I, right, and then go all the way. It would be like a long history show, right? And it would start even like towards the end of Reconstruction. And the guy I pitched it to said, "Love the idea, but no one will ever pick this up." And I said, "Why?" He says, "No one's interested in like pre-America that doesn't have like the formulated for the formed American national culture." He says it's even hard before to do pre-World War II stuff. He said, actually, you could probably do the Depression on into if you promise that you'll get to World War II at some point. And he said this, but in a different way. He said there's no real kind of national identity that American popular culture is really into pre that. He says maybe if you did a Civil War show or an American Revolution show, but those are big events. But just as a kind of like thing, no. And I think it's very interesting what Robinson is talking about here, this kind of development of the national kind of project and the national ideas or ideologies.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was trying to think of the name. Maybe you remember it. A couple of years ago, there was a series that only lasted like, I want to say like 10 episodes, that was about I don't know if they ever said that he was a member of the Communist Party or if he was supposed to be like IWW or whatever, but he was a communist minister, and it was in like, it must have been later. It must have been in the 1930s, like something like that. But it didn't last. I would say on the whole, like I appreciated it. It was a good show for, like maybe the first 5 episodes or so. I kind of lost it after that, but like it was a good attempt. I have to look that up,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it was an interesting thing. But yeah, it kind of, even that, I mean, I was shocked that it was actually run, but and it had some interesting episodes, episodes where it's like the peasants getting together and, you know, going at the bank, and stuff like that. And he was definitely trying to organize people and also use his role as a minister to like agitate people
Interesting.
towards like radicalism, towards communism.
Huh.
But yeah, it was an interesting show. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Damnation is the name of the show.
I saw the name of it, but I never saw it.
Yeah. Anyway, but yes, I think that point is really interesting and correct. I mean, I think that you do get very few films that deal with anything before, you know, before World War. You know, you might get a World War One film, but it's going to be
Hmm.
placed in Europe usually.
Right, because it's more interesting there, and we were only there for a year, and things that were happening domestically, it's not that interesting, especially if you leave white people. If you go into black people, it's really uninteresting, because my show will be focused on black people. So they were just kind of like, what? They were like, they didn't really get it, you know what? And it's funny because the guy who I pitched it to, he liked it. He thought it was great. He says, I'd want to watch it, but he says, no one's ever going to give you the money to do it. And I was like, wow, okay, interesting. And it was one of those, it was my first and my last attempt at ever doing TV.
It's fascinating, and I think that, yeah, I mean, it speaks to a lot of what Robinson's
Yep.
laying out here too. Is just say like, hey, the whole film industry is built around this national project, which doesn't exist prior to the early 20th century, really.
Yeah. And it has this nice coalescing point. Where do we,
Mhm.
so are we onto the railroads now? Or do we go before
So
that?
we can, but the just a
Go
little
ahead.
bit further. So the bottom of 183, he's talking about these different. He says the patricians, which in this case, I think he's talking about all of um, the people who are supporting film. Basically, he said,
Hmm.
however, had inadvertently incited a new and virulent phase of the race war, and in opposition to the racial demagogues, he, cites a bunch of people: Ben Tillman, James Vardaman, Theodore Bilbo, Furnifold Simmons, what a name, and Tom Watson, who appropriated the rhetoric of populism or emerged from its ruins. The same powerful class was compelled to impose Jim Crow as a quote unquote moderate compromise. It says, where the logic of demagogues led to genocidal consequences, quote, from the contention that no Negro shall vote to the contention that no Negro shall learn, that no Negro shall labor, and by implication that no Negro shall live, as Edgar Garner Murphy described it in 1910. The planters substituted segregation. He's just talking here about, you know, segregation as the answer to all of this prior labor on, their concerns around black and white solidarity within these different groups and unions and popular movements. Um and so so yeah and, and part of what he's showing here too is that this is not, strictly speaking, a Southern intervention, which is always something that Robinson, I think, wants to point people to. um, he says, quote, alongside the native elite, Northern capital stood subsidizing the railroads, extracting the coal, denuding the timber fields. He says the railroads are of particular interest in the formulation of the emerging racial regime of the late 19th century with which Jim Crow was associated. And, we can dig into this, but he goes into a whole bunch of examples to show which, if anybody's read about convict leasing, they're probably familiar with, but just basically this idea of working black people literally to death to build this railroad infrastructure, and coal and turpentine and resin, timber fields and sawmills, and basically that this was the one thing I found fascinating too. He says the state of Florida did not even construct state prisons, relieving taxpayers of that burden by leasing and working convicts to death. So yeah, I mean, it's just a summary of all of that, but he gives a lot of examples of how, ways that people died and how many people died as a result of this.
Yeah, I'm always reminded when I read stuff like this, like the brutality of like American development, of capital development. I'm like, I was actually having this not about this book, but with someone about that. They were talking about like, oh, it was a bit of an old times were better thing. And I was like, man, I don't know, dude. Read about like when they actually had to build these infrastructures of railroads that we have now, and like the amount of people who just died, who have no names.
Yeah, you don't even have to go that far back too. Like you
Re-
go to what's that book? Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. There's a whole
yeah.
section in the beginning of that where they talk about how many people were dying in like 1970 or 1968 or something like that of just being worked to death in freaking auto plants, I mean, it's wild how, and I think that's also one of the, if there's an area that another area where Robinson has some level of beef with Marx in particular, it's like that he doesn't spend enough time on the so-called primitive accumulation. Is that like he does have the imagery of, it dripping with blood and all of this stuff, but that, the brutality of that so-called primitive, um you know that's not accurately, or it's not adequately captured, or given enough analysis, I guess, in terms
Mm,
of, it's just something that comes up. I think it's interesting because I think there's some question too on translation, and I know some people have done some work on that to show that, like, Marx was really jabbing at um liberal political economists, and how the so-called primitive accumulation, for instance, was like a sarcastic dig at people who didn't care at all about, what happened prior to the accumulation. um but nonetheless, there are these areas where, you know and I think with Robinson also, like, one of the things he always wants to do is bring it down to um the people level, and get down to, like, make he wrote a critique of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped
oh
Africa,
wow.
actually. And it I don't want to misquote it, but there's a phrase something along the lines of, where are the African masses in this book, which is an interesting thing. So he always had issues with political economy, even Marxist political economy, that didn't feel like it was infused with, like, the lives and culture
Hmm.
and movements and rebellions of people from below. I don't know if I mean, I love Walter Rodney's work, so,
Same.
you know, but I just say that to say it's kind of a standard thing for Robinson to, like, really try to bring up all these little
Hmm.
elements from below and make sure they're given some care in their, analysis.
Hmm. So one of the next things, I mean, on that same kind of the next quote, he has this interesting quote here that I think is, "It is not surprising then that railroad corporations and their complements in lumber and coal played such a pivotal role in sponsoring the world's fairs and regional fairs of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, where the new race order was exhibited." So this is him, continuing to make these links, right? Of this corporation is working with this. It becomes a kind of interconnected web of development, right? Um, he brings in, the Aunt Jemima, the African savages again, and he starts talking about some of these companies. And he talks about these kind of like amusement films, which I find really interesting. Mutoscope was one of the companies, right? I mean, and I'll read you some of the titles. Got some of the titles. "Oh, That Watermelon Feast," "Dancing Darkies," and "Hard Wash." He has in parentheses, "A black woman frustrated since no matter how hard she scrubbed her child, it was never clean, i.e. white." And these are like 1896. So think about like the timing from the development of movies, and you have this, like, from like the first, stock of film and shot, then you have these kind of amusement pieces, right? And he goes into, like, Mutoscope as a company, um, how they were bought and, bonded and things like that. And
They're
then
also
he
known as Biograph too. It's like,
Biograph, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. He's
yeah,
talked about them a little bit along the way, but yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. And then so yeah, there's like, and then he was like, yeah, how like their vice president was like part of the coal companies. It's like this, it's this huge like, you know, web that connects together. And then he talks about Edison Manufacturing Company, but they did these like sex films, filming sex, which I was like, I did not know this at all. Right, the May Irwin kiss, racist comedies like the watermelon contest. You know, chicken. We talked about the chicken thieves thing comes up again. Another caricature was presented in the film A Morning Bath, which apparently complimented a Negro babes on exhibition, a sort of competition of which the New York Herald observed, as there are no standard comparisons of colored beauty, the voting was carried on with no little mirth. I mean, you're getting these like really odd pieces that they're creating for like enjoyment, for titillation of like, I guess, the people, and they're coming from the people who own these railroads and they own these companies. And it's like an important reminder that it was, you know, the big people, the big capitalists who were creating these pieces and these projects, which I find affirming to like just an overall sense of how I feel about the film industry and what it is. And that I think sometimes people think, I think people think about capitalism like this in general, that like, you know, like a liberal view of capitalism now is that like, you know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are like these grand deformities that basically, because capitalism for so long has just kind of been unjust, and it could have been more just. And because we didn't, you know, there wasn't enough checks and balances, we got, you know, Elon and Bezos rather than, I'm sorry, man, Edison was doing was doing Bezos shit way back in the day, bro. Like this ain't new.
I think that's a great point, and I think a lot of times the reason that we get those representations of those figures is because the old capitalists, the people who own, you know, CBS or, you know, ABC or whatever, are pissed off that somebody else has more power than them in the moment. And so
Mm,
then they want to, like, I think that's where you get the kind of inner capitalists rivalry, you know. I mean, this is a quick aside, but like I found it fascinating how in the inauguration, like the liberal media was kind of like for a day, like, oh, let's give this a chance. Like, let's see, you know, let's bring the country together. And then like as soon as Trump does his speech, he's like, he's still divisive and da da da. And then they start going in on, you know, reporting on every single executive order that he does and what it does. And you know, it's like, you know, I'm not saying any of this. Everything Trump is doing is horrible right now, for sure. But it is fascinating how you watch like the way that the narratives within liberal media, and it's very clearly liberal media, like the conservatives are right about that, that the way that it goes from, you know, an administration in which it really doesn't say anything about what the policies are of the Democratic Party when it's in power, to one in which you're suddenly getting reporting on every single executive order that the new president has done just to talk about how wild it is, you know. And it's like, so yeah, I just say, like, I think that's where you see this kind of rivalry of the sort of capitalist factions. And so yeah, I think when you see the stuff with Bezos or Musk or whatever, like they don't give that same attention to Bill Gates, you know, like yeah, anyway.
because he's the, I mean, I literally saw someone say the good billionaires. You know, we need to highlight the good billionaires. Like, yeah, exactly. Um, so do you have anything? Where do you want to go next with the railroad stuff?
The only thing that I found, you know, kind of interesting here is like, so he goes a little bit into like some censorship stuff, and like part of what he's showing is that like there was a lot of concern about different stuff that was being displayed in films. And there were various levels of the way it was censored. Some of it was through like official bodies that were supposed to regulate it, but more of it, it seemed like, was based on like the playhouses and the distribution networks and kind of stuff like that, which is, I think, important always for people to understand. Like censorship in the U.S. is a, is a very multifaceted thing, and it is not. I mean, this channel that we're on, this platform we're on, is a great example of, like, most of the time the censorship is like this, well, you can show whatever you like, but we're going to tell you it's not suitable for advertisers, or um we're going to demonetize you, or that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do get every once in a while that, like, somebody gets banned or they get taken off or whatever. um, but more often than not, it's this kind of regulation of, like, you can do whatever you want, but we're not gonna, like, support it, kind of thing. But the the part I thought just an interesting, he says among the most influential investment houses, right? So he talks about the railroads and all these people. And he talks about this period in which the railroads are, like, brought under this regulatory thing because of there's so much scandal in the railroads, but then the Supreme Court guts it. Message, right? And then he says, among the most influential of the investment houses were J.P. Morgan and Company, the Kuhn Loeb firm, and J and W Seligman. These same companies would prove to be critical to the future finance and corporation of the emerging film industry. I just think it, again, like, so then he goes more into, like, the ways that they um start to regulate. But then what he's saying is there is all this censorship going on, but what's not being censored in any way is anti-black racism. So it's like it's not as though the anti-black racism exists and it's being, like, challenged by some people who are like, oh no, don't do that. It's like, no, they're censoring all this other stuff, kissing and stuff like this, potentially, but they're not interested in censoring any of the representations of black people, which are, we can go into more of them, but yeah.
Which then, I mean, we're not there yet, but when we get to the Hayes Code, it then becomes interesting because then you realize how just politically motivated the Hayes Code was, right? I think people know it because of the decency stuff, but I think the Hayes Code, I don't think the Hayes Code has a lot much more body to it and intention than just the kind of, I don't know, Christian ideal, I think, thing that it's been kind of caricatured to just be, right? So then he goes back and to start talking about the minstrel movies, right? Non-black actors, corking up to represent blacks. It says, though survey data on the impact of films on audiences was still decades in the future, it is a reasonable assumption that the volume and persistence of such images reinforce the myriad of other degraded black significations available for urban and rural audiences. So he's starting to bring back in, and like he talked about a lot of these films that were made in Chicago by Selig, right? And yeah, like you get a lot of these. I don't even do these names again of these films again, but think of some of those names that I brought, and they're having the corked up people play these things, and Robbins is making the point that you're starting to develop this national signifiers of what black people are using this, and they're starting to kind of get an idea that becomes, and we're keeping that idea of the creating of an American identity, a national identity. We're starting to see the slow seeds of it happen. I thought this other part is really good. This line, despite the possibility of apocryphal tales of early film audiences ducking to avoid onrushing trains or returning the fire of on-screen gunmen, it is credible that some 70 years into the American minstrel phenomenon that even newcomers weren't aware that these performers were not actually black. ? That the outrageous dilemmas besetting these characters bore only the barest traces of brutal realities of black life. He says some other stuff, but I want to skip to this other line that he has. But it is more probable that the constancy of the disguise is repetition in film after film, and its reinforcement in other sites of the public sphere may have exhausted that reservation. On the other hand, since filmmakers found it necessary to cast non-blacks as blacks, that might appear as a substantiation of black inferiority. Blacks, it would seem, were not even competent enough to portray themselves. And he puts an exclamation point there. So it's so interesting. He's like showing the multiple levels of the degradation of black imagery, but also black humanity through imagery, right? And whichever way you skin it, there is a degradation that is happening, right? And he uses this a lot to also, once again, and I don't want to really get into it, some of the scholars he felt did poor work in talking about this. So he uses these examples to say, no, these scholars missed the boat in kind of downplaying it or pushing the responsibility towards the kind of negative thought around black people to other sectors of the world. Rather, he's saying, no, look at the multiple strands of how this actually goes into the social degradation of black people in this country.
Yeah, totally. There's a I don't know if you're ready to go to it.
Oh,
and
go,
also
go.
if y'all hear my dog chewing in the background, she's eating, so I can't do anything about that. He goes
ahead.
into the section on Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's like a pretty prolonged section. So I'm going to read a couple parts and then summarize a couple. So, as one might suppose, the synergy between American capital and the racial representation displayed in American silent movies extended beyond the domestic sphere. Mexicans and Mexican Americans, too, were signified by chromatic categories determined by the binary set of black and white. As the second largest national minority of color, Mexican Americans had both a social presence and some significance in film consumption. For instance, of particular interest here, Mexican laborers comprised some 70% of rail workers in Texas, in Western railroads, and were being recruited as mine workers in Arizona. But of far greater significance for William Randolph Hearst, John D. Rockefeller, and the Guggenheims, Mexico itself was a potentially lucrative site for investment, exploitation, and further territorial appropriation. Texas and California had been seized in the mid-19th century. Hearst, for example, owned, quote, the huge hacienda of Babacora in Chihuahua, and in 1912 had urged the Taft administration to support the counter-revolution led by Pascual Orozco Jr. against the Francisco Madero government. Frustrated on that score during the Wilson administration, Hearst chose different tactics. So then, yeah, he starts paying for films. There's a 15-part serial called Patria. The film depicted a Japanese-Mexican invasion of the United States and was clearly designed to capitalize on the nervousness of many Americans who felt over revolution in Mexico. It goes on and talks about in the Hearst papers and others continued to link revolutionary Mexico with German, Russian, and Japanese plans to invade the United States. The social base of the peasant-dominated 1910 revolution was the largest threat to American capital. Consequently, it is understandable that if the film industry distinguished between a white, virtuous Mexican aristocracy and a darker, villainous peasantry. He then equates, so the term greaser comes up here, which is fascinating. I didn't know this particular, I associate that more with like the 1970s, like, and 60s, I guess. Like, you get that in kind of films like Grease, but also like, associating it with the N-word, right, is one of the things he does here. But part of what he's talking about too, and this is to go to like somebody like Gerald Horne, is this history of a very different like a really interesting counter history, I guess, within Mexico. Talks about Vicente Guerrero, who was, quote unquote mulatto, and he says in 1910, dark-skinned mestizos and Indians in the northern states joined with similarly dark-skinned southern peasants like Emilio Zapata to overthrow the dictatorial state headed by Don Porfirio Diaz. In American films, light-skinned Mexicans, he lists a bunch of folks, were accorded honorary white identities. And then he notes if dark-skinned, they could play... if light-skinned, they could play any nationality, including American. Dark-skinned actors were fated to play servants or appear as villains. On the other end of the spectrum from white, Mexican and Mexican-American players displaying Indian, mestizo, or even black features remained largely unrecognized, sunk into the anonymity of the N-word / greaser. So again, like, I thought this was really interesting because he doesn't focus on this a lot in this chapter, but he said it earlier on. He's like wanted people to understand that it wasn't only black people that this ruling elite was using the film industry to, impose racial regimes, to demonize groups of people, right? They were also concerned with this revolution in Mexico and with the underclasses, and also wanted to project, which is complicated within Mexican history as it is within a lot of Latin America, but project really a strictly kind of American, like a Jim Crow almost racial regime of, we only talk about the whites as the white Mexicans in a certain way, and then the dark-skinned Mexicans in another way. Whereas he's showing, like, within the history of Mexico, there's actually this contestation where you have, so-called dark-skinned Mexicans being presidents or leading revolutionary struggles or different things like that. And so, this is American capital, putting a particular frame, and also that fascinating part about Japanese Mexican invasion. Again, like, it feels very current if you just shift it to like Chinese Mexican Iranian invasion or something like that in today's world.
Yeah, and then think about the character of Japan of that time too, like the isolationist Japan that was still like this kind of thing, and trying to setting up and what would happen, like 8 years later with World War One, the greaser thing was wild. I mean, like, even they had like a whole series of greaser films, the Greaser's Gauntlet, The Girl in the Greaser, right? Like, I mean, there's like 5 films with 5 films here listed with the word greaser in it, right? But then he says how World War One then ruptured the habit. He said World War One ruptured these films. German and then Russians became the foreign villains of choice. So that just shows you like the shift. And I think we can recognize that right now. Like, think about how, the 70s into really the 50s through the 70s to like the mid 80s, it was just all Soviets. Soviets were the thing. Then by like the mid 80s, you started getting more Islamic fundamentalists.
I always find it fascinating that the terrorists in Back to the Future are Libyan.
Yes, exactly. It's funny because the kid, I didn't catch that. I think I watched it again when I was like 19. I was like, Libyan, or weird movies like Rambo 2 that really make no sense, like politically. Like, you have a guy who I guess is supposed to be Soviet, but he looks slightly German, and he's in Vietnam. It just doesn't make any sense. They make these weird hybrid characters.
So I have to say this. So, maybe I can pull up a clip in a bit, but Robinson had he collected racist paraphernalia. Like, he collected like what I would describe. So one example. So he kept one of the Mujahideen Rambo 3 action figures. So he remained
those.
So he remained throughout his whole life, like, kind of fascinated with these racial regimes and racial depictions within Hollywood and popular culture, so called. Um, and so yeah, actually, I'm going to see if I can find a little clip, but also just another note, because he refers a lot to world system in this chapter, and other folks have talked about he worked alongside Emmanuel Wallerstein, and I'm forgetting one of the other names of the guys who started, were key into world systems theory. But I also found out that like he had books. He would have like copies of Monthly Review or other stuff like that, and he would like have all these annotations on like Samir Amin articles and stuff like that. And so like I think it's just really important to understand too, because sometimes he gets, because of the friction in different areas between him and Marx and Marxisms of different kinds or whatever, like I think people don't understand what an incredible student he was and how much interest he had in Marxist political economy, Marxist world systems, kind of thinking and so on. And that he like really studied that stuff. And as you can see throughout this whole chapter, like he cites a lot of the work of different folks. And so, yeah, I just think that's always important for people to understand is it's for him, it's like his critiques are not rejections. Like they're just like areas where he holds everybody to very high standards, and he'll be critical of anyone that he disagrees with. Don't always have to agree with his disagreements, right? But like I think it's important to understand that there's an incredible amount of he just read everything, and was really interested in all types of radical and left-wing scholarship too.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it even if we talk about this next part because so he talks about World War One, how Germans and Russians became the foreign villains, but then he also said how after it, the Mexican government they initiated a huge boycott against those films. They were like, we can't have in it, have those in here. Um, he says something, he writes here, the boycott softened the treatment of Mexicans as characters, but the Mexican Revolution still needed containment, both actually and symbolically. The socialist, syndicalist, and anarchist currents emanating from the Mexican Revolution were intolerable to American capital. The American government, of course, intervened on several occasions to attempt to protect American interests. One thing I thought here that I don't want to really go into, this actually makes the Zapata westerns that happened in the 60s to then be also more interesting. Films like Duck You Sucker. Oh God, what's the one with Gian Maria Volante? God, I forget the name of it. I watched it recently. But these are films. Zapata westerns are A Bullet for a General, right? They're essentially revolutionary films that were made in the 60s in Italy through Italian companies because Italy, as they were going through their own Marxism, they couldn't make films that were about Marxist revolutions inside Italy. So they had to kind of do a Brechtian offshoot. So they chose the Mexican Revolution and American intervention also. Bullet for a General is all about a Mexican. He's not a revolutionary at first. He's or maybe he is a revolutionary. Well, it's a debate. But he gets manipulated by an American. And at the end of the film, he realizes the manipulation. So I find that interesting, this statement here, and then what would then come later in the revolutionary 60s in movies, and that as like a reference point to kind of Mexican American tension, but particularly around revolution, like socialism, these type of things, like that particular strand also I think is just really interesting because these films, even Duck You Sucker by which I think is actually Sergio Leone's best film, using the IRA, and an IRA person helps a Mexican become a revolutionary. They join the revolution. So and he's reading everything from Bakunin to Marx in the film. They have a Mao quote at the beginning of the film. So it is an interesting thing that I'm realizing that I feel like those people were aware of those long links of the American hostility towards Mexico, not just because because of the greaser thing, but also because of that very revolutionary spirit that was happening just right on our border.
Absolutely. And, Christina Heatherton was somebody who was, like, very influenced by Robinson, I believe. I'm 99% sure that she was also one of his students at one point, and, she wrote a book called Arise, which is all about, revolutionary Mexican, the importance of the Mexican Revolution within, uh, you know, radical socialists, left-wing internationalism, prior to the Russian Revolution, and, that's yeah, so anyways, it's interesting. Um, again, there's a connection there. As I was reading this, I was thinking like, yeah, like, I I wonder if, their time together or whatever, like, spurred her to take on that interest. I haven't
Mhm,
actually read that book, but it's on my list of ones to do.
mhm.
But yeah, anyway.
Cool.
Um, so where should we jump ahead to now?
So I mean, we probably finish the stuff
He
with
goes into more
Mexico.
of the yeah, he goes more into the stuff around censorship and all of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Is Hays Code coming now, or is that a little bit more?
let's
Hmm.
see. He does talk about on 195 the organizational foundations of the production code.
Mhm.
Can be traced to the other significant gesture Hayes made in 1922. He established the Committee on Public Relations as a consulting group on motion picture standards, and among the 60 organizations recruited to the committee, Hayes included the expected interested parties. Uh, by avoiding more aggressively hostile associations like Crafts International Reform Bureau or collaborators of Christ Church, um, Canon William Sheaf, uh, Chase New York Society for the Prevention of Crime, Hayes proceeded to institutionalize self regulation. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to say more about the Hayes Code.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So he goes into like, I mean, there was also a lot of political battles when it came to like censorship and these different things. So he talks about this one group, the MPPC. I wish I had it before in front of me. You have like there was the National Board of Censorship, which then became the National Board of Review. And there's like these constant legal battles, right? And then there's also in 1915 its existence. There was a Supreme Court decision of Birth of a Nation, which determined the motion picture were not speech and thus not protected under the First Amendment. So you have these constant, legal battles over this stuff, and it was going into the courts, which makes sense because on one hand, you have this new technology, they want to use it, you have different interests. We talked about like elites have different, you know, elites don't always agree. They agree that they want to stay elite. That's the one agreement that they have. They all want to stay elite, and they want the people who are not elites to stay at the bottom. But how to stay elites, they consistently disagree on, right? And there was all these different bills and things like that, and different people were added to these various censorship commissions and so forth and so on. And then he talks about these public relations disasters, which I found really interesting, and I've actually heard of a few of them, right? And then a series of public relations disasters struck the movie business. In 1920, Mary Pickford, the highest salaried actor in the industry, was alleged to have committed bigamy with her new marriage to Douglas Fairbanks. This is actually a very, if you live in the movie industry a lot, it's a very famous kind of story. In 1921, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, I love these old school names, was charged with manslaughter in the press. The charges were rape and murder in the death of starlet Virginia Rapp. And in 1922, director William Desmond Taylor was shot and killed at home with rumors of sex with actresses Mabel Normand and Mary Miles Minter, and drugs splashed across the nation's newspaper. Confronted with declining box office receipts and even more intense activity from film reformers, the industry's collective response to these setbacks was the creation of a new formal self-regulatory agency, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA. To head it was then William Hayes, right? They bring in Hayes. Hoover. He was President Hoover's postmaster general. And Hayes' first official act was the banishment of Fatty Arbuckle from films for life. So Robinson's basically bringing in the kind of publicly bawdy nature that kind of happened in the film industry became too much for it. So they basically needed a strong man to go in there and, get it together, right? And so you begin to get what we call about like these like production codes, right? I'm trying to think, where is it here? By avoiding. Yeah, and it's funny, like all the different people that kind of get involved with the production codes. Hayes recruits included prominent Catholic and Jewish organizations, moral education agencies like the National Congress of Mothers and Parent Teacher Associations, the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, the YWCA, the General Federation of Women's Clubs. I mean, he is getting U.S. Chambers of Commerce, Anglo Patriots like the Daughters of the American Revolution. He's bringing in a lot of interesting groups to help him kind of create this code. You were going to say something, Jared?
Just a fascinating, like, minor note, but it says in 1915, its existence was inadvertently. The existence is like one of these regulatory commissions, but was inadvertently prolonged by a Supreme Court decision on the birth of a nation, which determined that motion pictures were not speech and thus not protected under the First Amendment. So I found that fascinating too, as just a point, as like, in 1915, you get a decision that basically says films can be censored. This is not speech, which is a very interesting, I think, thing, just in general with like the whole idea of free speech within the United States is such a sort of propaganda thing. But I found it fascinating that early that they would make a decision that you could regulate certain imagery within films, that a government could step in and say, actually, no, you can't have that. And I know this is a precursor to the Hays Code and like some of the other regulatory stuff that goes on that you're alluding to. But I think that's an important kind of contextual thing, that they were concerned enough with filmic representations that they and it's interesting, he doesn't actually say what it was about birth that spurred this lawsuit, but maybe, yeah, I don't know. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting point.
No, 100%, because I think the thing to remember, and I think then with the Hays Code it becomes really important, is that it's not just that you have the ability to say you can't say this. It also develops the ability to say you have to say this, right? So it's like a two-pronged thing with censorship, right? It's not just forbidding, it's also forcing you to do it a particular way, right? And then, so he also talks about some of the other consultants or interest groups, right? Which had contributed to the new architecture of scientific racism and Jim Crow, which he wrote. Like, so you have the Academy of Political Science, American Federation of Labor, American Museum of Natural History, which, if you live here in New York, you know about the pernicious history of that place. The Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Cooper Union.
Shout out to Shailene Rodriguez, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the War Department. Also, like, it's funny, you see all these things that he just writes the War Department, right? It metamorphed. Say this committee metamorphed. It changed into the Department of Public Relations in 1925, Studio Relations Committee 1927, and eventually into the Production Code Administration (PCA) in 1934. So Oh yeah, what is this? And from the eliminations required by state such the first don'ts and be careful guidelines. So I actually grabbed these. The don'ts and be careful guidelines in the Hayes Code are wild. But like when you read them, they because when I was taught about the Hayes Code, often I was taught as like a kind of like a Christian thing. I think people misunderstand it, like it's like, oh, America was like, still not on its religious shackles. It's not usually taught to people, I think, very politically, if it's taught at all, right? But yeah, like your don'ts, right? um Pointed profanity, right? You can't have nudity, any inference of sex perversion, the illegal trafficking of drugs, white slavery, but miscegenation is in there.
I wanna go back on the white slavery point to just
We
something
need to. Yeah, go ahead.
really quickly. So, I sent this to Orasami Burton as soon as I saw it because, let's see, can I find the exact part? I might have to find it in a minute, but
Mhm.
let's see. Uh, so John D. Rockefeller, I mean, the Rockefellers are always just in some really weird stuff. Like it just is always, it doesn't fail. Um, and of course they're involved, he's talked about them at different points. Um, Nash, National Citibank they ran at the time, and you know, that was related to, the invasion of Haiti that he talked about back earlier on. But like, in Orsanmi's work too around Attica, of course, Norman Rockefeller is the governor of New York at that time. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff with him in Tip of the Spear, but you see, this is a footnote on page 187. He said, perhaps the most sensationalized issue was that of quote unquote white slavery, with that is white female prostitution. Case Loan's own contribution is to document the production of sexploitation photoplays from the earliest cinema. See Loud Silence. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been the foreman of a special grand jury which reported on white slave traffic in New York in 1910. The grand jury findings led to the creation of a Bureau of Social Hygiene, which established a laboratory of social hygiene in Bedford Hills to conduct clinical studies of prostitutes housed in the adjacent reformatory and conduct a citywide survey directed by George Nealand of houses of ill repute and 2,000 prostitutes. And so, anyway, I just say that to say, like, there is this, yeah, the Rockefellers are so weird and they're into all kinds of really weird stuff, but they also always insert themselves into the again, like talking about people like Elon Musk, right? Or like they always inserted themselves into these kind of government and regulatory things. And, they're also just fascinated with how people think and their sexuality and like all this stuff. And anyway, I just wanted to stop and say that because you said the white slavery and it brought up that footnote to mind. But yeah, anyway, a very, very, one of those families that, I think there's probably some really good books out there. I know they come up quite a bit in The Devil's Chessboard, which is about
Mm,
the Kennedy assassination and their relationship to the Dulles brothers and stuff like that. But like, yeah, some really kind of dark and sinister stuff going on there too, I think. But that's
yeah.
my opinion.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. No, I agree with you. And I mean, the fact that they would use white slavery, which it's funny because when I had not looked at the don'ts and be carefuls for years. And when I saw the white slavery thing, I was like, oh, wow. Because like if you look at it, there's only 11 don'ts. right? And like that miscegenation, I mean, a lot of it has to do with sex, right? Children's sex organs, ridicule of them, but then like ridicule of the clergy. Like it's just right, you know. And then the be carefuls are very interesting. And I have to read the kind of statement of the be careful. Special care must be exercised in the manner in which the following subjects are treated to end that vulgarity and suggestiveness may be eliminated and that good taste may be emphasized. So like you couldn't do things like arson, you know, firearms, safe cracking. So things that are, you know, maybe probably associated with revolutions, right? So maybe if you wanted to have a safe cracker, but like the safe cracker was then caught and then, you know, taken in or something like that, maybe you could do it. But I mean, there's sedition, like first night scene, so you couldn't have like the first night that you had sex after marriage. Right, a whole like a lot of wild interesting things, but a lot of it also was like to please the various interest groups that he had to get this support, right? So because I'm sure, like, you know, one of those like the daughters of this, we don't want first night scenes, right? Okay, we'll write that in there. You gonna write a check though, and when I need you to do something for me, you gotta help me out. It clearly feels like a list made by a bunch of lobbyists trying to get one or two things in there so he can maintain support. So it's because it's so all over the place. It's like so all over the place. Like there's no way that you can even follow it correctly to a certain degree. Right? It just makes no
Yeah.
sense. You
No,
know?
I know. And that's what I mean too about like the Rockefellers to some extent is like there's this fascination with how people think, and it gets connected to like I mean a lot of this stuff really evolves out of race science also into then this this emphasis on like the psychological factors that cause like criminality and deviance and all of this. And so there's they're really interested in regulating how people think and understanding what causes people to not be a pliant, you know, worker essentially, like, you know, what causes people to deviate from what they want people to do in terms of their role within society. And the other note, I mean, I don't know if you had other do you have other things on that? There's one kind
The
of
only
quote
the
here
only other
from
thing
yeah.
was the thing about the railroads.
Okay, go ahead.
And then he was saying, so there was a point where even when you were having these production codes, right? Um he said filmmakers were admonished for considering ill-advised but sometimes realistic representations of railroads. So certain political projects that were happening or capital building projects in America, kind of the same thing, were able to get protection from the Hays Code, right? An unflattering portrayal of clergymen, social workers, charity workers, women's clubs, philanthropic organizations, newspaper publishers, and radio broadcasters. So they would go through these constant review processes. You know, I mean, I'll read this one quote. The production code itself stipulated that the history, institutions, prominent people, and citizenry of other nations shall be represented fairly, and filmmakers were compelled to halt or alter projects which contain unflattering representations of substantial import markets. So this is the thing, the import markets as Mexico, France, and Italy and Germany. Even the Irish represented a powerful combination of interests, the least influential of which was the Irish state. Less consistently, however, were the protections extended to Asian peoples.
Yeah.
So like it's a huge like political project of exporting and importing things. There's a whole it's not it's about capital and like
Yeah.
how they want to maintain and flow capital and create things and so forth and so on.
And then he goes on to say, conspicuously absent from all this close monitoring, we've mentioned this before, of the industry was any concern for the degrading representation of American blacks and the lesser races, e.g., Africans, Slavs, Filipinos, Native Americans, who had been exhibited at the 1893 and 1904 World's Fairs. No Black or even multiracial organizations participated in the committee, and the PCA's principal concerns with race were the enforcing of Jim Crow. Quote, the code banned miscegenation in movies, but industry policy had more to say about the treatment of race relations on the screen. Southern states objected to social mingling of blacks and whites, and in order to preserve their trade, such scenes were consistently altered during production. So there's a little bit, then he goes on to correct some of the scholarship here. I don't know if you
Mm-hmm.
had any points on this, but
No,
yeah.
it's
But
good. I
I
mean,
just
he.
found
I
that
feel
all
like he. I
interesting.
feel like. Yeah, I feel like he. I mean, people who are reading, I think he makes some good, really good interventions on like how on the perspectives of the scholarship, and I think it's really good. Really good points he makes. I also one quick note. So the lesser racist thing, the thing with the Slavs, then it just further makes sense to me how much Russian and then Soviet cinema detested American cinema, for multiple reasons. Part of it is the representations were just so poor, so it gave them an insight to look at how racist and xenophobic the imageries were.
Yeah, he also does again this interesting part about, he said one charge the studio bosses couldn't shake was that they were
Oh
Jews pursuing a
yeah,
Jewish agenda antithetical to white America. In one form, anti-Semitism took the guise of the accusation of greed. Almost as frequently, the issue was one of hegemony, quote, the thinly veiled fear of a Jewish plutocracy destroying a Protestant democracy. So it's interesting because he talks about how this was like an issue, right? Because the perception and some reality, I mean, because there were a lot of Jewish, um, studio heads and things like this, that the perception from society was that, this was an issue with Jews controlling the media, right? Which is, of course, the anti-Semitic sort of trope that we get a lot, but
mm-hmm.
it also, it causes somewhat of an issue with the regulation too, because it's like it probably leads to them appeasing more other interests, in order to kind of cement their own role, because they have to kind of, but one of the things he notes too is that um these are not, he talks about, let's see, in sharp contrast to the progressive Jews so critical to the American left and socialism for generations, the studio managers facilitated rather than challenged racial domination, right? So this is an important point that he's making, is it's like, it's not like you have, a bunch of, it's not cultural Marxism. It's not like you have a bunch of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy within the film industry, as the right would say, right?
Yeah.
He's saying like, no, like they actually were key to the cementing of Jim Crow through filmic representation. So
Yeah. Yeah, and he continues to talk about the peculiarities of that. And he makes like a final point in this section that I think is really good, that I think I want to read a good amount of it. So he says, it would appear then that white supremacy in early American films was a privileged domain, a protected discourse. The burlesque and grotesque black, the savage primitive Indian, the sinister erotic Oriental, the brutally stupid Mexican were not oversights of casually contrived art, and their mixed race others were suspended in the attendant inevitable tragedy of the unnatural. Films were a thoroughly policed product. Little was left to chance. Regulations emanating from corporate boardrooms in New York, official state and municipal censors all over the country, the Production Code Administration and studio headquarters proved the formal rules of industry policy and for decency, while religious organizations and other moral reform groups steadily drummed complementary themes in the background. At the onset of mass movie production, apartheid was a structural instrument of American capital, and American filmmakers supplied a galaxy of imagery and storylines which naturalized and popularized white hegemony. He has a lot more that he'll say there, but I think that's a good kind of summation in there, unless you want to add anything else. But like his final
No.
sections, like you always say, are really good. He does a really good job of like summing up his chapters. I do agree with that. And but
Yeah.
he makes that point. You know, I think that point is that it's always been policed, you know, and films still are, you know. Bela Tarr, it's funny, the great Hungarian filmmaker, has this amazing quote that I'm not going to say verbatim, but a guy asked him, he says, you know, Western guy that just assumes that he has a negative view of communism. I don't really know what Tar's view is on communism, but the guy's assuming it. He goes, so, you know, you had to deal with the tyranny of, you know, communism, you know, and how do you feel now that you're making films and not communism? He says, now I deal with the tyranny of capitalism. And it's like, and that's his point. He's like, stop, you know, like stop acting like I'm free now to make stuff. He's like, it's tyrannical. I say capitalism is tyrannical. It's a tyrannical beast, and I'm policed on what I can and I cannot do, you know.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get to it in a bit, but I thought it was cool how Robinson pulled in some Soviet film and
Yeah.
discussion in this piece too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the next section is called the Black Middle Class and the mulatto genre.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't have a lot of notes from this section myself. Did you have any that
I
you
have
really want
I
to
have a
highlight? Yeah.
couple. So there's a couple things that he says here that I think is really interesting in the beginning that are actually not about that topic as much as he does this thing that I think is really cool, where he talks about the development of the Los Angeles kind of studio space, and he ties that to the ideas of the hegemony and the creation of the movie structure, the hierarchy. It's really interesting. I'll read it. The segregation of Los Angeles laborers in auto production, aircraft manufacturing, steel plants, public service, and public education, the development of white suburbs and Latino and Black ghettos, the planning of public transportation to decentralize the region, like streetcars operated by the Pacific Electric, the establishment of race-based and racist municipal and county public safety, police, and firemen organizations, the design of electoral districts and voting systems hostile to the poor and minority communities, racially restrictive access to loans and investment capital. These initiatives span far beyond the reach of the studio moguls. So he's kind of showing that, like, there is this like studio system that's developing within LA, but there's also this social reality that's developing in LA. And if you talk to anyone who knows, like, if you talk to anybody from LA, and I've lived there for a little bit, one of the things that is constantly talked about, and I think you talking about here with like the wildfires, is the segregation of LA and the kind of planned well, really all cities have this, but the kind of planned designations of where people live, who gets to do what, who gets to move where. But in LA, I always felt like it was very pronounced, partly because of transportation, the car culture that exists there, the development of the freeways and things like that that would come later. And in the chapter, there's a way that I'm reading it that he is tying this development of a kind of hierarchical and regimes that are there to also how movies are made, exhibited, who gets to do what, who gets to be where. He's doing that kind of parallelogram thing, you know, it's like a parallel thing, you know, with it. And I think it's really nice. I think it's a really good, he talks about like the developers of like Culver City and Van Nuys. He talks about all of this development of Los Angeles, right? And he has this line: Hollywood, to be sure, was a creature of big capital, and it was the Bank of Italy's, later to become the Bank of America, Attilio, and then Amadeo Giannini, who first began subsidizing the fledgling film industry months before the investment houses like Kuhn Loeb provided a 10 million line of credit to famous players, the future Paramount Pictures. So like it's part of this large project. And like it's not so, like, if you think about the things that take place in LA, the segregation, all of the I mean, we could list it, the various atrocities that have happened to Mexican folks, Black folks, the class stratification between white folks in LA, all types of stuff. It's directly tied to movie industry. Like and there's a sense when you talk to people who are from LA, they know this. They may not know it like specifically because they're not historians, but they know it though. They know that big movie industry, entertainment industry behemoth is part of the social reality of why things exist in that space. And I thought Robinson doing a nice little intervention here was really a really good setup for this chapter or this section.
Yeah, right on. There's an interesting part about the importance of the Black middle class
Yeah.
here. He brings in E. Franklin Frazier, some really good stuff going on here. But it's also, like he says, the emergence of the quote unquote mulatto genre coincided with challenges to American capitalism and the dominant racial regime by the very existence of the Black middle class, and particularly by a militant faction of that class, which I think is an interesting thing. I mean, this is
what page is that
next,
again? Is there something there I wanted to talk about? What page is that?
So that's 205.
Yeah.
And if
Okay.
I jump too far ahead, we can go back. No, I
You're
think
totally fine.
actually, yeah. But this is one of the things with Robinson is that he also, and this does connect back to Black Marxism for him too, is that a lot of the prominent Black socialist thinkers are petit bourgeoisie figures, right? So Du Bois, C.L.R. James, like these are people, Richard Wright. These are people that, although Richard Wright, as he talks about, was working class, by origin. But the it's an interesting stratum to Robinson, and that he sees, and you could kind of see it with like Cabral and like talking about class suicide and this kind of idea, just this notion. I also think it's borne out by a lot of history of just communist parties and movements and figures that a lot of times they are kind of these middle class, Marx himself, like sort of middle class figures that have the ability to, do a lot of studying, a lot of theorizing, a lot of intellectualizing around, thinking about the way society is constructed and how to change it. And so you have those radical elements, but those are not the elements, of course, that the American capital once ever portrayed, right? Which is, again, this will get to Micheaux and why Micheaux is kind of important. But also that it wants to, lift up the elements that are willing to like get really on board with, you know, with capitalism and, the system in the United States, basically. But it's complicated, of course, because of segregation too. Also, so there's a quote on 205. He says one of the primary concerns which agitated political and economic elites was the increasingly visible links between socialism and Black militancy. The founding of the NAACP, for example, had resulted largely from the efforts of Black and white socialists. If elements of the Black petit bourgeoisie continue to move more towards the political left, they might well draw Black workers into a political terrain which could be more resistant to the lures of white supremacy. To some gatekeepers, it appeared that no sooner had a rural collectivist movement of Black and white farmers been disposed of than a similar political force would be assembling in the cities, right? And so, yeah, he goes on to more. You can add more if you want there, but I just thought that was interesting. He draws in socialism, socialist parties, and so on at this point too.
Yeah, no, I was really intrigued by this, and because then he does continue with it, like how the socialist principles were just really in the social reform movements at large. So I think he's like positing that, the power that socialism had as a thing that needed to be, destroyed by the state. I did find that interesting. I mean, it does track about the history of the black middle class or the intellectual class or the educated class, developing that. And yeah, he brings in like Eugene Debs in here, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about the fact that the socialist parties were the parties that were opposed to racism,
Racism,
and
right?
that and that this also drew in a lot of black intellectuals from um this sphere too, right? And
Hmm.
there's
Which,
a there's yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and then he you can go, but then he eventually brings in Du Bois, where he starts to kind of bring in Du Bois, because then Du
Yeah.
Bois kind of plays a significant role in this chapter. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's just this quote, and he's quoting here from I think a book called Negro and the Communist Party. But it says the capitalist class seeks to foster and increase color prejudice and race hatred between the white worker and the black so as to make their social and economic interests to appear to be separate and antagonistic. The party's program resolved to enlist black workers into the mobilization of labor in general, thus creating a race blind radical movement. And though the party had minimal results with ordinary black workers, such declarations did attract black radical intellectuals such as Chandler Owen, A. Philip Randolph, and Du Bois. In the 1912 presidential election, socialist candidate Eugene Debs attracted nearly 1 million votes, and quote over 1,000 socialists won state and local office. Woodrow Wilson won that election, but among Teddy Roosevelt's third party supporters were wealthy men, quote, well aware that it might take progressivism to head off socialism, end quote. Given the increasing threat from the left, other powerful facets of American capitalism resolved that the black middle class was a necessary target. That part I always think is important too, because we often on the left use this term progressive or think about progressivism as like a sort of a space through which you can kind of get some kind of alliance between left liberals and those of us who are communist or socialists or maybe anarchists. And you know from the beginning that movement has always been about trying to head off the left, really, channel them back into what would now be the Democratic Party, but in different phases of history was other parties like the Progressive Party and so on. So
Yeah, so then like Robinson, he begins to talk about like more of like the black middle class like culture, right? Uh and it's interesting because he'll use it for something kind of right after him. He talks about all these different how they were covered in like magazines and things like that. He lists all the different kind of things that they were, and the different clubs that they had, debutante parties, receptions for visiting nobles, musical and dramatic recitals. So you do have this culture of black middle class ascendancy that is existing. Um and he talks about like some of them were like men's clubs devoted to class consolidation and occasionally fundraising for charity, settlement houses, and the like. Um it's interesting to me. Like I find it all very interesting. I definitely have my questions about that kind of activity. Like what were their relationships outside of the charity with black people who weren't of that class? Um, that's all.
I think we're yeah, I
Yeah.
think Robinson has some critiques
Yes,
of
I know.
them
I,
there.
I
Yeah,
I know.
yeah,
I know.
yeah.
I know. I know he does. So when I'm like, but when I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I'm like, I'm
Hmm.
thinking about that. And then yeah, he starts talking about some of the other different groups, the black women organizations that exist. And then
It's fascinating too because he brings in people like Madam C.J.
I was
Walker and
about to go there right
like
now.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
like he brings in a lot of these people again. When you think about it, it gets to the Michelle point that we made at the beginning of like when you think about who is celebrated among the firsts, like what was
Hmm.
their orientation, to different things. Yeah, there's a comment here. He says, to minimize the humiliations of Jim Crow, the black middle class entertained at home in comfortable, richly furnished buildings with salons sufficiently large to accommodate select social gatherings. Frequently, they lived anywhere they could afford, startling otherwise non-black neighbors into new realizations or relocation. So yeah, he does start to get into like some of the friction too that happened also as the black middle class like tried to find, you know, places
Yeah.
that it could live or integrate, and like then that you get that. But yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm skipping like too far ahead. He then, talks about the elite black middle class was educated, just proud and justly proud that many of its members had graduated from some of the most prestigious universities and colleges in the country. A goodly proportion of them were also light complexion, some of the descendants of the most eminent of patriarchs of 18th and 19th century America. Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, for example, were the sons of white slave owners. The succeeding generations were often as arrogant as Douglass and strident where Washington had feigned humility. So when they entered the political arena, their existence jarred white supremacists on several levels. So yeah, it becomes this kind of push and pull, right? They have a certain attitude towards, which I think is very familiar towards, maybe or a way they deal with black people who have less. But then there is an antagonism that also happens with the white elite, also, right? They don't and they want to thumb their nose at the white elite, like, hey, you can't bring me down. So it becomes this tug of war. Right. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, representatives of this elite, most prominently W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, and William Monroe Trotter, banded with other blacks in the creation of a succession of militant organizations like the NACW, the Niagara Movement, the National Equal Rights League, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, NAACP. Yeah, so really bringing out these things to public attention.
Go to the White House, meet with Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, do all that type of stuff. Yeah.
Trotter, they talks about Trotter. He says, obviously outraged by Wilson's patronizing and condescending comments about defending his policies as a charitable gesture towards blacks. Trotter had contradicted Wilson, speaking over the president's attempt to interrupt him. Wilson was insulted, claiming no one had dared to speak with him in that manner since he assumed office. In the future, Wilson demanded any further discussions with the organization would require Trotter's absence. And in 1915, Terrell, this is Mary Church Terrell, and other aristocrats lobbied against anti-miscegenation legislation being considered by Congress. So then it says, just so long as the black middle class kept to themselves and their private comforts and accommodations, the far-flung apparatus of the new racial regime tolerated them as a necessary evil, a broker stratum between capital and super exploited black workers. So that's an important point too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like the most important point, right? You can have a petty bourgeois as long as they're not inciting the workers to join up with them or things like that. They're fine with it. They get it. It has to happen. They got to keep them around. So then he goes more into Du Bois. He brings up the crisis, which is a real important piece of history. The NAACP's monthly magazine. And there is this in 1915, Du Bois does this thing, the Negro, right? He says his most audacious challenge to the racist canons of modernist historiography. On the surface, the Negro was a study of history of Africa and the African diaspora. And years afterwards, later readers would attempt to pinion its significance, right? So the Negro, this really seminal piece by W.E.B. Du Bois, he invokes this now into the text Robinson as this kind of challenge because of the negative and really ahistorical look at black people as a intervention towards that. And he and Robinson brings this into the conversation.
Yeah, and just to clarify, like he's shortening it there, but that is the Philadelphia Negro. So
Oh,
it's
yes.
that's the
Yeah.
the text that he's referencing there.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, he goes on again. I mean, the amount of interest in this book around interracial marriages and miscegenation. It keeps coming up as a topic. And it, again, like that, we'll get to Micheaux in a minute.
Yeah.
Um, there's so then there's this, he goes quite a bit into this film, The N-word.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not gonna read the title.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think we need to go through
No.
all of his synopsis, but are there pieces from it that you thought were important? He spends quite a bit of time going through, like, the creation of this film, as well as some of the things that are going on within it.
I think one of the things, what did I have? I have just one part highlighted. So one of the things to say about it's a lost film. It's a film that we can't see anymore. But if I'm remembering correctly, I guess they have the script still is what it is, right?
Yeah, they have a synopsis of it
Synopsis.
that
Yeah.
was, I think, written contemporaneously with the film.
Right. So there's this one part about the dialogue in the film, right? Um, so it says the dialogue centers the reader's attention on the dramatic and conflict-ridden themes of race mixture, racial misdirection, passing and exposure discovery. But in the background, the two illustrated male figures confront each other from the perspective of different worlds, while the white figures impassively stares at the black man from the vantage of an ancient and noble civilization. The black man, costumed in the ragged trousers and chains of modern slavery, beseeches his superior for recognition. In this historical imposture, the confrontation of two eras separated by 1,000 years, the advertisement for the N-word reproduces the conceits of the birth. White signify the world's civilizations. Blacks chained to a dark world of perpetual enslavement are reduced to supplications. There is no direct relationship, however, between the plot of the N-word and this illustration. So yeah, I mean, it's talking about kind of the imagery of this. Yeah, like so many of the other films of this era, the N-word is a lost film, but if the actual film reflected the synopsis, then the publicity department at Fox mischievously deceived the public by linking the N-word with birth. So this is a conversation of like, is it the same as birth? They have their differences and their similarities. But if I'm remembering correctly, miscegenation and the idea of the mulatto is the kind of real big linking factor and the linking theme.
It is. I think that he has there's a weird part because there's something that he kind of categorizes as, um I don't want to say subversive, but it departed from what he calls stock characterizations of the mulatto. He says there's only two films. Um, so he says, yeah. So the mulatto raises. So it says, basically, I'm trying to get to the crux of it, but what he says basically, the part that was interesting is that the director, I guess, was from the South, so had more access, or more grew up around more black people and more discussion of black people than D.W. Griffith. Um, and he basically doesn't, I wish I could remember. Maybe I'll find it. But
Mm-hmm.
the point was that he was making was his analysis was like, he was sort of asked if his representations of the mulatta in the story could be seen as subversive, and he's like, basically like, no, but he puts all of the problems of black people, in his opinion, are because they drink too much. This is his takeaway, right? So he's like, it, which I don't know exactly what Robinson's doing with this, but he's kind of, again, showing that there are at least one or two different representations within a film that is otherwise very racist. Um, but that the point that he's making is that this particular director, um, was basically part of the temperance movement too, which was a big thing, obviously, at the time, and so was trying to use the film to push a temperance agenda, and as such, like, kind of inadvertently undermines, um, some of the representations of mixed race Black people. And I think what Robinson's showing is like this is largely an anomaly, but uh, I think he's partly setting it up so that when we get to In Our Gates, um, to show a different take, but also to note that it is this topic of discussion. And then he goes into a number of other examples of films in which the representations of mixed race folks, so-called. I hate that we have these like ridiculous terms that we have to parse, but
Yes,
um
yeah.
uh goes to the worse. He says in the following year in 1918, the depiction of mulattoes took another turn for the worse. And then he goes through a bunch of examples of, a mulatto kills her white foster father, a mulatto betrays his race by succumbing to his congenital character. Um, a mulatto frequents brothels, seduces and secretly marries his benefactor's daughter, and later rapes and kills a maid. Like, so he's just going through
Yeah.
like all of these extremely ridiculous racist depictions of mixed race figures. And I think a lot of that is to set up then to understand Within Our Gates in part as a response, of course, to Birth of a Nation, which it directly is, but also to all of these other representations that are going on at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and definitely all of these, like, you definitely see the quote unquote tragic mulatto stuff is really, really the rave for those kinds of films when I'm looking at the plot lines, and you can see the breadth of that within it. I don't know if I have anything else in this piece. Do you have anything else in this section?
No, not really. I mean, the last I guess we could read this last section. He says, um what does seem incontrovertible is that these films help to insulate into the proper culture the principle that the loyalty of the Black subordinate to the white upper classes trumped any claims or demands that the Black middle class militants might infuse into the national discourse. No ambition attached to the Black masses or articulated on their behalves could possibly compete with the quote unquote legitimate needs of the white upper classes and by extension all whites. In stunning contrast, these films depicted quote unquote faithful slaves, demonstrated that, as Gerald Butters Jr. observes, quote, faithful African American compatriots seemed not to exist in the modern era, end quote, coupled with casual violence meted out to Black chicken thieves in the minstrel comedies, which dominated Black cinematic representations. The corollary was obvious, given the self serving stridency of leaders drawn from the damaged stock of race mixing. No American immigrant or native should wonder about or object to the necessity of lynchings or occasional anti-Black pogroms to put things right. So again, just like talking again about the connection between what white supremacist order hopes that people get out of it to all of this film work.
Yeah, and I sent a text to Jared about this. I don't know if people have seen this documentary, Hitler's Hollywood. It's a pretty good documentary. And it's basically about the film industry under the Reich, the Third Reich. And they actually show clips of a lot of the films and the plots, and they talk about them. And one of the things the film does talk about is a very similar thing to what Robinson is saying here. It's like they needed to create, because a lot of the films that we know, because these are ones that probably survive, are the more like the Nazi stuff, the Triumph of Will. Those are the things that you could probably get a look at. But really, the really heavily anti-Semitic stuff, things like Jusus, which is like very infamous, you can't really get those films or see those films, and they're abhorrent. Like, I've seen the clips you see in Hitler's Hollywood are just they're heavy to watch. But the film is very clear. The pogroms that they wanted to do against Jews and things like that, they needed to create a visual database an ideological database for people to kind of draw from to be like, well, this is necessary. I just watched this movie and look how terrible they are. They're going to come after my children and my daughters and things like that. So it's interesting to see this kind of thing and think about how movies were used in different regimes to do different things. It just rang very similar to me when I was reading that.
Yeah. Well, let's jump to the next section. So we have
Yeah.
race films and resistance. This is a really interesting section of the chapter. Do you want to start us off on this?
Yeah. So Robinson starts to talk about what these idea of race films, which I think is very interesting. I'll just read this first little part right here. The present state of research indicates that race films made their first appearance somewhere around 1910 with William Foster's The Pullman Porter. Back then, they were called race films because they were targeted for Black movie-going market, frequently arranged in separate or segregated theaters. These audiences quickly recognized and adapted to the emergence of race films since they were already familiar with the terms race men and race women. For at least one generation before the decade 1910 to 1920, race men and women were familiar figures, usually educated or affluent Blacks who publicly or at least noticeably championed causes for the uplift of the race. And he puts uplift in quotes. I think he actually had quoted that earlier. He did that, the uplift thing, the idea of racial uplift. So these ideas that these films would be a kind of, the characters in the film are about these kinds of uplifts, right? So Robinson then goes into many of the kind of different kind of scholarship around it, right? Scholar Michelle Wallace, for one, has asserted that race films were produced usually for the specific purpose of rescuing the image of Blacks from the deleterious impression made by the caricature film. So the films that we had talked about earlier, Jane Gaines has gone even further, maintaining that ironically, although the race film pioneers started from the assumption that they knew who they were and who the race audience would be, they were, as they produced, directed, and exhibited their product, actually constituting the race community. So then he brings in Lincoln Motion Picture Company, who was producing uplift romances and melodramas, which will become important for Micheaux in a moment. But Lincoln Motion Picture Company was one that sometimes is credited. I don't know if he says this. I've seen it credited as the first. I don't know if Robinson says that. But I have seen it credited as the first. I don't want to put that on Robinson if it's wrong, but I have seen it said that, right? So then Robinson, I think in a good way, wants to kind of complicate a little bit the idea of race films and Black films and Black cinema. And I think it's actually I think it's a good intervention. More than a decade ago, Tommy Lott is another scholar, provided a standard by which to distinguish Black cinema, put in quotations, from the plethora of race films which appeared during the silent era. Locke countered, he's talking about countering Cripps, who we've talked about before, right? Because Cripps's definition was theater films about the Black experience that are produced, written, directed, and performed by Black people for a primarily Black audience, which is interesting because I feel like I know people today who would actually still go with the Cripps thought. Lott countered. The white cultural nationalism of Hollywood's Eurocentric empire requires something like a third cinema, and I'll get to third cinema in a moment, movement to help non-white people survive the oppressive and self-destructive consciousness that empire seeks to perpetuate. In short, Lott's construction of Black cinema was defined by Black filmmaking practices fundamentally concerned with the issues that currently define the political struggle of Black people. So, third cinema movement is a movement that comes out of the 60s, third world Marxism, things like that connected to it. Latin America, Africa are probably the two main fronts. Really, a lot of the written theorists of third cinema are Cuban and Brazilian. Tomas Gutierrez Aleas, one of the big ones. Solinas, who did like Hour of the Furnaces and Gatino. But then people also do put people like Semben within it, though I don't know if Semben ever actually referred to himself as a third cinema filmmaker. I'd actually have to look at that, or even Mambete. I'd actually have to look at that. I don't think they did, actually, personally, but they get kind of put into that it. And really what it is it's about a filmmaking practice that's, anti-colonial, revolutionary. There's not kind of one third cinema. Glauber Rocha is another one to also involve in it, though he would have been Cinema Novo. So it's actually very big. But I think like a third cinema movement. So I think what Lott is saying, not the third cinema movement, but like it needs to be something that is in opposition to Hollywood, because the third cinema idea is that Hollywood is a tyrannical imperialist force, and for a group of people who deal with imperialism, colonialism, and so forth and so on, they would need to break from it, not just economically, but also within practice, which I think is a line. Black filmmaking practices, right? So Lott's intervention is saying here, if we're going to talk about Black cinema, it actually can't be a Hollywood. It can't be Black Hollywood, which something that I've said for a long time personally. And I'm with Lott on this. So Robinson's doing an interesting thing here, kind of setting up, I think, how he's going to want us to kind of look at the work. Do you want to add anything, Jay?
Not a lot. I think that's right on. He draws in CLR James's critique of Gone with the Wind, where he says the essentials of Negro slavery still remain over large parts of the South, and says using Lott's criteria, then these films, and this is talking about race films, which again, black made films for predominantly Black audiences, he said would not qualify as Black cinema. To the contrary, drawing on Michelle Wallace's categorization, many of them exploited Black caricatures for the amusement of their largely Black audiences. This raises issues with the overt evaluations of Crips or the partially concealed essentialism in hooks. I just had to say, I highlighted that last part too, because he doesn't at any point cite bell hooks in the whole thing. And part of me was like, well, I don't know that that's what he's doing here, but like it's lowercase hooks, like she spelled her name. So that's just an interesting, that's my assumption, is that it's a little bit of a jab at bell hooks there, but I'm not positive on that. And so I can't say for sure, because he doesn't even have a footnote with it or anything. It's interesting.
I literally was like, when I read it, I was like, oh, when did he mention bell hooks? I missed that. And I literally went back like 4 or 5.
I did word searches and all of this. I was like, where
is Bell? Though I could see, I'm not going to try to speak for Robinson. I could see possibly where he would want to think that, but I would have to think a bit more about her work in that way. But I think this was also important, actually, because I do think, and I don't want to dwell too long on this, I think the Crips model actually still exists pretty heavy. And I think it has significant purchase, which I find to be very, very bothersome. So he brings in Gerald Butters again, which I think is really an interesting one. And he says, Butters' characterization of companies which produce race films offers some relief at first glance. I distinguish between 3 predominant artistic forms of Black cinematic imagery. The first category includes films produced by companies owned and controlled by African Americans. The second category includes all Black films produced by independent companies owned by Euro-Americans, but with African American creative participation. These companies were outside the Hollywood system. The third category includes films produced by major white motion picture studios. Butters insists that at least between 1913 and 1929, the majority of Black independent features, his first category, were dramatic, in contrast to the comedic form favored by Hollywood studios. I don't know if we mentioned that comedies were preferred Yeah, that was another. I think it's in a previous part of the chapter that comedies were just really preferred, and black dramas were just not. They were just like, nah, we're good. We don't want that. And so that's one thing that was mentioned earlier in the chapter. Um, Leaping beyond this construction, it would be comforting to learn that the black-owned production companies more frequently rose to the challenge of defending the race from its detractors. But film historians have had difficulty in characterizing the cultural, moral, and aesthetic import of the race film. This should not be completely surprising, since race films had in common mostly the superficialities of being produced with black casts for predominantly black audiences. Splitting this simplistic formation, on the other hand, was a myriad of intervening variables between the idea and the realization of race films. So, yeah, like, and it'll get into Micheaux. There's a way I read that Robinson has a complication with the race films, right? Like, I don't think he has what's I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. He's not dissing them. I think he's like the utility.
No, like there's a point, and I can't remember, but it's in like one of the footnotes where he kind of says like, you can't really blame this on the creators because like they're confined within this industry that like wants them to do certain things, is kind of what he's saying.
Right. But I think what he gets to later is just because they're race films, which I think is really important, doesn't mean they were just this great subversive moment in itself.
For sure. Yeah,
And I think that's what
Yeah.
he's kind of fighting. He's like, no, they were part of a material order that we have to kind of acknowledge, which I think is really accurate. And I'm happy that he makes that. So he kind of gets into like, first of all, there's actually more companies than I thought. That's one thing he does. I mean, he lists more companies that exist who made films that
He said a
I
lot of them were only able to make one or two films.
right. So they're which also is just interesting that. And I'd be curious to ask him. I guess he kind of says it in his book implicitly, but explicitly, I would love, that this was an arena that they said we have to do this. They were like, whites are making films, we need to do it also. Like, I just find it very interesting. Yeah, like raising capital for independent productions was equally capricious. As Charlene Register has demonstrated, the most successful and therefore the most inventive black filmmaker was Oscar Micheaux. Like many of his cohorts, Micheaux was frequently forced to accompany the single print of his film on tour. So meaning he only has one, collecting rentals from exhibitions and inveigling small investors support his next film, which I just think is a fascinating. Think about this. Like, you got a film, you have one real canister, you got to go from each city to each city or town and state, right? And you do it and you'll be like, I want to make another one. Can you give me some money? Like, this consistent thing, right? No, there is no sending it out and it's playing at 500 theaters at once. Not happening, right? And he had to travel with it all the time. Multiple prints was not happening.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
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 And it's also why, just to be clear too, because so Within Our Gates is not the first black film that's produced. It's
Not even Michelle's
early.
first film, yeah.
Right. Right. It's not his first film, but it is the oldest one still. Like, it's a first in the sense as it's like it's the earliest that we still have a full copy of, basically. And again, we only have it because somebody found the print, or found the reel in Spain somewhere, but it was the Spanish reel with Spanish subtitles and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, there's so many old silent movies like that. You just be like, oh yeah, we found this copy. It's here, and it was sitting in someone's den. Like, it's wild. It's wild. Even to like movies that are even more recent, like that are like in the 60s and the 70s. You hear about this all the time. Where do you want to go next on this? I mean, there's a lot of stuff about the development of the system of making the films, the distribution, how it worked.
Yeah. I think so one of the interesting things that he goes into, he calls race film thus constituted an anarchic cottage industry rather than a genre. And since
Mm,
the only regulatory enforcement was the market and the censors, race films required few conventions in narration, cinematography, aesthetics, finance, production, and the like. In order to probe resistance in the race film, superficialities must be set aside so as distinguish between the majority of race films and those few which evidenced an opposition to the racial regime. While some of these movies pursued the regimes through a contested iconography, others delved deeper into the construction of knowledge which collaborated with racism, right? And so he then brings Lot back in. This is on 231. This is interesting. I think this is the only time he actually uses the term racial capitalism in the book. I have to double check, but normally he uses capitalism and racial regime. But he says here, he says, employing the standards suggested by Lot, then there were only a few black films among the legion of race films. Rather than a profound challenge or radical critique of racial capitalism, the most daring of the race film producers seem to have been contented with displays of bourgeois respectability and modest uplift themes. On occasion, however, some of their films achieved a kind of aesthetic poetry. He cites some of the different ones that survive. Um, but one of the things that he does talk about here, and this is where then he gets down to bringing in Micheaux. He does talk about how there may have been a Toussaint Louverture film that uh, basically we don't know whether it was ever screened anywhere, whether it was actually finished, but it was supposed to be. Um, but I can't remember. I'm trying to find an exact quote, but there's a point at which he basically he talks about a lot of different stuff within this genre, also a lot of the kind of reproduction of different racist tropes within it. Um, but basically, he's like within all of these films, except for Micheaux, he's like there's an absence of radical critique and of um, showing this elements of the black intelligentsia that are more left leaning, as well as showing like elements of kind of working class black folks so he really posits that Micheaux is a kind of revolutionary figure within all of this as compared with his counterparts in the era.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's same. I gathered that. I found that a very provocative intervention that he did there. Personally, I was like, "That's good," and I don't say provocative like to diminish it. I actually to kind of like lift it. It's just because I think of what it does is it challenges the notion of black film just being a thing that is produced because you are thus black and then you made a black film, right? It sets the standards higher, and I find that to be
Yeah.
very, 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 very good and needed.
He also goes in, he then pulls back in a lot of these elements of what's going on, World War One.
Yeah.
He brings in um, the return of black troops and what get called the race riots, but we might better say like pogroms and resistance, that's going on. And this idea again, miscegenation becomes this concern. There's this idea promulgated that black soldiers have learned to sleep with French women and are going to come back for the white women in the United States, which then also is coinciding roughly with like Birth of a Nation.
Hmm.
So again, he's providing a lot of context um, of what the world in which Micheaux is also producing within our gates, which we've talked about quite a bit through um, the other discussions. I do have some stuff on 241. Do you have anything before that?
No, I mean, I had you pretty much said what I was gonna say about World War One and all that. Yeah, that I had that section highlighted. I don't think there's anything else. Yeah, like the percentages. Yeah, go ahead. You can go forward.
Awesome. So I had highlighted basically this whole page, so I'm gonna read a little bit of it and
So did
summarize some of it.
I.
Yeah,
It's kind of hilarious. It's there though.
yeah. You can start it. Go ahead, because I just talked a bunch.
The hegemonic call. Go from there.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's where I am. Yep.
I'll do the first paragraph and you can do the second. All right. The hegemonic call of the race film melodramas was for complete assimilation into Anglo-Saxon identity and culture. Black Saxonism was imagined and cinematically realized as the ideal status in American society. In both private and public spheres, race melodramas presented characters entirely fluent with the social conventions governing the white middle class, whether it be in professions, lifestyles, family, or intimate relations. A class-based combination of white and black was Black Saxonism's most covetous ambition. The imagined universe of whiteness invested in these films was, of course, largely an artifice. It normalized the middle class by obliterating all other classes of blacks or trivializing them in caricatures or representations of villainy. But it could be seen to be authentic because it assumed knowledge of the moral and civil society, which reiterated the first order of the racial binary. Like the natural order of race, which distinguished whiteness and white likeness from blackness and black likeness. Black Saxonism distinguished and marked the good and the bad in the divisions of labor, social recreation, power relations in the family, and intimacy. The contest between good and evil was easily discerned and evaluated.
I just have to say this sentence just haunted me in terms of thinking about so much, you know, quote unquote black, meaning largely black casts, black produced to a certain, I'm thinking of Cosby Show, Prince of
Mm-hmm.
Bel-Air,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it normalized the middle class by obliterating all other classes of blacks or
Yeah.
trivializing them in caricatures or representations of villainy. I mean, that is like so much of the not all, but so much of the black television even that I grew up with, um of just like if there was somebody who was poor or working class that came in, it's usually a character. I mean, even the French Prince, you can think about him, as this kind
As
of
a character in
interloper,
general.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but yeah, but the norm, the thing that is there that is dominant and constant and everything else is obliterated is this kind of middle class. And I mean, it's actually true in large parts in representations of white society
Yep.
within the United States as well. Usually you have people who are quite well off, and you can tell by the houses they live in or the apartments they have or whatever. And that this stands in as like this is what our world is like, this is what society is like, and like never mind that none of you actually live this reality. It obliterates everything else unless it's going to bring it in to like show it as less than or deviant in some way, or like, fascinating. Just that sentence is like going to really stick with me. It
Yeah.
normalized the middle class by obliterating all other classes of blacks or
Blacks.
trivializing them in caricatures or representations of villainy. I just think that's like such an astute observation of what's
Yeah.
going on in Hollywood in general.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and the idea that it is the imagined universe of whiteness. I I remember many years ago, I had a friend of mine, and she grew up. I forgot where she grew up, but she grew up somewhere in the South, and she grew up, very very poor. And I remember the Cosby Show came up once, and she told me she said she hated it. And a black woman, right? She hated it. And I said, "What show did you watch when you were young?" She said, "I watched Roseanne." I said, "Really?" I was like, "Yeah," because I watched it too. And she was like, "I watched
Yeah.
Roseanne." She was like, "Why?" She's like, "Because they were poor
Yeah.
and they were struggling." She was like my mom.
Or yeah, or people watch the Bundys a lot where I grew up
Right.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. And her thing was that, like, she said, I asked her, well, did you find the Cosbys to be real? She was like, no, like I just didn't believe it. Like she was like, and I think she had couple people up north she knew, and they even told her that they were like, yeah. I told her like, yeah, I'm from New York. That's bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Like, unless been harassed by the cops episode, that shit is not real. You know what I'm saying? Theo comes home pissed because the cops done got him. I don't buy the Cosby Show. And it's funny because they did it at the end when they brought in Erica Alexander, the poor person who they brought into their home, which like was a character they only had for like half a season too. But then after a while, they got disinterested in that, and then they marginalized that character. But not to go too much into that. But it's really interesting.
No, it is. It's very fascinating,
Yeah.
the way that even still persists.
Yeah.
So it says, in the end, no matter how compelling their exposition of interpersonal conflicts or how appealing their characters, the best of the race films fell short of Lott's call for a cinema which confronted, quote, the oppressive and self-destructive consciousness the empire seeks to perpetuate, end quote. Well, the Black comedies dared to transgress beyond the boundaries of an imaginary all-Black world. Melodramatic race films quarantined their Black subjects from even the suggestion that outside of the movie frame, Blacks were in a struggle for their very lives. Notwithstanding their liberal conceits, race films most likely secured a magic window for their Black consumers, inviting them into a world where racial antagonisms were somehow held in abeyance, and ordinary Blacks functioned without constraints in the achievement of their class and material ambitions. Whether in the form of comedy or melodrama, the fabulous world of race films dissolved race by exclusion. Much like the imaginary in the mainstream cinema, they projected a homogeneous society which was constantly troubled by racial conflict. Such a social construct had no need for Black cinema. Important clarification, constantly untroubled by racial conflict. So racial conflict's not there in those films. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a way that you could posit that current Black Hollywood lives within the race film paradigm. I don't maybe a few peculiarities that are different here and there. But I to me, when I read that, I a lot of movies that we see just pop into my brain. Ding 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 that are very popular. And there's also like an inverse thing, and I'm not going to get too much into this. I got into a thing with about a very popular movie that's out currently that's not about a Black subject but has a Black lead. And I don't like the film, and I my intervention on it was it's a film very much about identity, yet it completely ignores the character's race. And people were like, well, why does it have to acknowledge the race? Which I found to be absurd in a film that's all about the signifiers of gender identity. I was like, of identity, period. I was like, right. But it's interesting because it's dissolved by exclusion. It's like we're just going to dissolve race as a factor in society simply by like not talking about it. But like to kind of also get like brownie points for making your lead Black within the representation points and the and this is a white director doing this film, within the way of being able to score points of you being inclusive, dynamic, or subversive, so forth and so on. So very interesting. Yeah.
So from there we get to the section Micheaux's Black film.
Mm-hmm.
So he starts it. Black cinema and authentically oppositional cinema required a central, culturally rich terrain at which converge sufficiently vital sources of Black social and political energy and the historical, expressive, and intellectual textures of Black life. It should not be entirely surprising that it was in Chicago that a genuinely Black cinema appeared, while New York hosted its share of Black and faux Black independent film companies. There is some evidence that Chicago boasted a Black audience, which expected a more militant cinema. I found this really interesting section too. He
Same.
goes into a lot of, and I'll let you if you want to add different parts of it, but just a lot of, the social milieu of Chicago, the influx of jazz musicians from New Orleans who could make a living in Chicago, where often they couldn't even in New Orleans. The fact that you had Black elites that were, again, like, white Chicagoans did not want to welcome them in. So, like, also, again, creates these segregated communities where the elites are in community with Black, poor, and working class folks. And Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting thing. And there was also, I remember one of the earlier chapters, one of my comments was that I wish that there were some kind of even if it anecdotal um, representations of how people who went to film responded to it and so on. And he does a little bit of that here, which I appreciated. Um, and so, yeah, yeah, go ahead if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I found the Chicago stuff very, 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 very intriguing. I will also admit when I wanted to do the Micheaux film, that if that would have got greenlit, that was one of the things that I actually wanted to look into, was like the presence of Chicago. Um, Partly because I have some distant family, like back in the days, who were in Chicago, or probably around that time or a little bit after, like my grandfather and some of his people. So, and I've heard like secondhand stories of like Black Chicago of that period. And so when I read that, this like tracked with things that I had heard like anecdotally from like family. Um, yeah, so he goes into to kind of separating Micheaux from some of the other people like Foster and Pollard, right? Like he has this line like, on closer inspection, Micheaux was easily distanced from his peers. Of course, Micheaux advertised himself as a race man, and Bowser and Spence, Gaines, Cripps, these are the other critics, and others enumerate the multiple instances where Micheaux publicized himself as a filmmaker intent on exhibiting the prodigious promise and achievements of Black people. There was, however, a distinction in Micheaux's sense of his mission which profoundly altered the relationship he sought with his audience. Micheaux insisted on the obligation to display the truth. Quote, I have always tried to make my photoplays represent the truth, to lay before the race a cross-section of its own life, to view the colored heart from close range. My result might have been narrow at times, due perhaps to certain limited situations which I endeavored to portray, but in those limited situations, the truth was the predominant characteristic. So, he actually calls Foster and Pollard hucksters. He's not Robinson. He's not very kind to them at all.
He never minces words when he
No,
doesn't.
he doesn't. It's funny because I wasn't sure that he disliked them, but then I said, "Oh, okay. Now I see how you feel." I was like, "Oh, damn. All right, bro. Cool." And right after praising Micheaux, a couple of things from that I find very interesting. First of all, it's like a side. The photo play thing I find very interesting, and I'm actually gonna do some of my. I'm actually very curious about when people stopped saying photo plays and then went to film. I'm actually very interested in that because it's very interesting. But it also highlights the connection of theater and photography and film not yet being its own thing, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, like you see Robinson beginning to kind of separate Micheaux, but based on his intentions, the intentionality of his films, like how he's trying to go. I also find Micheaux being able to be self-critical. I've seen this quote before, actually, but I find his self-criticism very interesting. It might have been narrow, this and that, but I was doing the job that I was able to do. Um, so Go ahead. You want to jump
Oh,
in?
he just yeah. I mean, like, there's this part about in 1907, Wilson, a lawyer and politician, published a critique of his community, distinguishing between Black society proper and a more ostentatious nouveau riche group, and complaining that, quote, an excess of democracy existed among Negroes, which, though beneficial in some respects, had a fatal policy of dragging everything down to its level, end quote. However, more politicized and democratic race agents in the growing Black community encouraged the formation of a coherent and self-conscious Black public sphere. This is after he talks about working class migration, which would be probably what's that? The great, a phase of the Great Migration. He also said the Black elite of Chicago strove even more vigorously for a bourgeois identity, which frequently mimicked the manners, exclusions, and tastes of a white upper middle class. But what he talks about is that, like, this caused a push for further segregation. So the white folks, the white upper class and middle class, were not having this. And Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if there's more you want to pull in, but it's the other thing too is there's like this whole thing too around sections of the Black elite also doing all of this like kind of morality policing of Black working class people too. But yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to get into actually the music. That part I thought was interesting. So one of the things, and this is something that I also knew, was the Black Chicago music culture was very big, partly because it was a place that you could actually earn a living as a Black musician. And he gives like these kind of like numbers of the amount of Black musicians that were able to kind of exist there. Um, and he talks about how it became a kind of core essence of Black Chicago. And then what's interesting is, it brought even work even into the movie industry. He talks about how Louis Armstrong and Count Basie, they played in pit bands, providing accompaniment for silent films. And then how that even got them to go to LA and shoot and things like that. And this becomes important in the chapter because how Robinson begins to kind of talk about the creative character of Micheaux's work is around jazz. And it's kind of his container to kind of talk about the Micheaux technique, I would say, which I think is really good.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that because I did find that really interesting. I also
Yeah.
always am like when Robinson does this from time to time, and sometimes I think like I'm like, how much are you projecting like what you want this to be to like, but
It was a little
yeah.
it's a little projecty. That's what I would say. Maybe we can get to it in a moment, or we will get to it. Maybe I'll say it up top. How I took it was he likes Micheaux's work and he needed a way to speak on it, so he created a kind of container. I do think he is prescribing a lot. He's not being as descriptive as maybe I would like him to be about the work, but I get it. I get it for the book. I think he's doing it because I think also he's trying to kind of create a kind of link chain to the world. It's like kind of like the process of this book. I'm not saying it's like completely unfounded, but I do think it was it goes a little too grand at times, but at the same token, I can understand.
Yeah, and I mean, he might not, I'm not saying he's wrong either. It's
Hmm.
just sort of like that was an interesting element in this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's a great paragraph here. It says the purpose of these recitations. So it's like this is summary again, as after he's laid out all this stuff on Black Chicago and jazz and everything else. He says, and also I think you said this, but just to say again, like, um, you know, yeah, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, like performed during silent films. I always think it's important people understand about like putting yourself in what was it like to see a silent film. You're going to a cinema where there's like a band, at least a piano player or whatever, right? And they're playing along to the film. And so when you watch them, sometimes you have like soundtracks added. Those are usually added after the fact I think they always are, to like mimic what that experience would have been like. But you would have been in this live, probably pretty raucous, space where you actually have musicians playing live to what's going on screen. And so I think in that sense too, the connection to jazz actually holds a lot more kind of, water or whatever you want to say. Like I think it makes sense in that sense too, that yeah, I mean, like there is this connection that would be very close, in terms of if that is the sound vehicle also of your film, that is, you have a relationship with this art form,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't want to speak out of turn, or because Eisenstein does talk about this in his essay on sound. And if I'm remembering correctly, he does compare the cut to music partly because the pre sound sync era, music would be the thing to help to linking that. So he does talk about, so what you're saying kind of tracks in that way. There is an acknowledgement often by the filmmaker, because of how they learn rhythm is through the musical palette, because that's what they had. They knew that's what it would be.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, anyways, he says the purpose of these recitations is to document the appearance of this extraordinary form in Chicago, where Micheaux was formulating his vision of an appropriate refutation of the Dixon Griffith film. For certain and for a multiplicity of reasons, he sought to skewer the mimetic social impulses of the black petite bourgeoisie and its hegemonic model of acceptable ambition. This would be achieved in his contestation with the uplift contraptions of race film. More substantive and radical was the means by which he shredded the melodrama genre, the favored storytelling device of both dominant racial narrative and its imitators, by appropriating the melodic and rhythmic constructs of jazz. Here he was employing the expressive voice of a collective Black stratagem of hidden transcripts asserted against narratives of oppression. The convergent negations of race and anti-racism, of bourgeois class arrogance and working class subjectivity, of quote unquote white conceit and historical realities, of the litany of racial insults exposed to Black nobility, transformed within our gates into perhaps the only Black film of the silent film era. And that, again, he's making that connection of Black cinema. He's saying, like, if we're using Lot's construction,
Mhm.
in his view, this is really the only one that lives up to the standard.
Yeah, I think that's I'm into that. I think I like the idea, like when he goes more substantive and radical was the means by which he shredded the melodrama genre. So I do think he's right. When I was looking at Within Our Gates again, there is a way that the film is the way Micheaux's choices have such like a like a almost a distancing effect. He's not looking to fully envelop. It's there's like it's almost like you're watching from like a, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a through a window almost. More than any other films that I seen. Like I think when Griffith is really trying to enrapture you, right? Gus Chase, all this type of stuff, right? While there is a way, and I feel like Within Our Gates, like a gate, I'm gated and I'm looking at these people and I'm getting, he's almost like denying, I think, like an over identification to a degree. And I think that is it. The melodic rhythmic constructs of jazz, I was not as convinced that is the way he's doing it. I thought it was more in how Micheaux is using frame. and keeping us kind of separated. There was a way I was talking to someone about this, about I was having a conversation with a filmmaker friend, a black filmmaker friend, about he made a film that he felt he's proud of it, but he feels like he made a mistake in it being too like the white people could get they could get under the bones of it. So his next film that he's just did, he's distanced a lot more, and he's finding a lot more pushback with the film. And I said to him, I said, I think it's a lot like Within Our Gates. You're gating you're gating their access, right? We're inside and you can't jump in like that. So I think that to me was something I found really provocative about it. I get what he's trying to do, and we could talk more about it as we keep going. But I that's not what I saw when I was re-looking at the film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this paragraph on 248 also stood out to me. I mean, he goes into this thing about, like, he goes back and forth. He talks about call and response. He talks about, spirituals, and like he gets into some of the, history of Black music and culture. He says, by the time Micheaux's creative work in films, quote, the classic jazz harmonies were basically diatonic, embellished sporadically by secondary structures and occasionally by upper extensions, sevenths, ninths, 11ths,
Mm-hmm.
13ths, occurring in or against the underlying harmonies, and especially in extemporized renderings of the melody. In Within Our Gates, Micheaux would employ counterpart and fragments and scales of counter themes, for example, flashbacks within flashbacks, to mark ruptures or interceptions of the melodramatic style, to signify irony and paradox, and to construct alternative narratives in effect and hermeneutic of the oppressed. So yeah, that, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, that part I was really, though, I thought that was great. The idea of, because so the call and response thing, you would say, is probably not only something that Micheaux would do, because if you think about the title, or whatever, the dialogue card or whatever, and then you would go into the image, right? But there is a way that Micheaux is particularly strong at what lines he uses and how he couples that with the image, going to the line, then coming back to the next image, and then what he progresses with. He does have a particularly different peculiarity to it that I can't really, I would have to look through it and like go through it a bit more specifically to talk about. But it is different. And then the flashbacks within the flashbacks, totally, yes. And it's funny, like, when I first saw this film years ago, that was the part that I liked the most. I was like, oh, that's cool, right? Like these like counter themes, right? And it is rupturing the style. And I think that's part of the reason why he's creating a distance, because melodrama, the whole thing about melodrama is placing you in the story and enrapturing you and getting you so emotionally drunk that you can't be an analytical individual. I think that's different here, because he's doing that. He's rupturing the melodramatic style, and he's giving you these different kind of interventions and irony and paradox. You actually have the ability to become more of an interlocutor rather than a passive spectator, which I think is like, that actually lifts this film a lot higher than just being a first, as like the reason why it's only important. I mean, like, yeah, I'm like looking at like the preacher scene right here, like the way it's like constructed is so wild. Like, it's just wild. It's a really wild construction and really high level stuff, in my opinion. But yeah, that part
Yeah,
I really dug.
absolutely. So do you have anything before 249, 250?
No, I don't.
Okay, because I highlighted like all of that again.
Yeah. Yeah, I have 250 highlighted. Yeah, and parts of
Yeah.
249.
So, yeah, so he starts it by saying, by the 1920s, American silent films had begun the crystallization of narrative structure and technique that would later become known as the classic Hollywood narrative. as Robert Allen and Douglas Gomery argue, quote, the story the Hollywood film relates involves a continuous cause-effect chain motivated by the desires or needs of individual characters and usually resolved by the fulfillment of those desires or needs, end quote. This linear organization of the story film with its interior explanatory conceits was adapted from 19th century literature and theater, and the novel, the play, and the film were expressions of the emergent bourgeois culture, which required a singular protagonist whose consciousness gave order and meaning to whatever events were encountered or relationships realized. Then he goes, capitalism sacralized the metaphorical wolf as the most efficient agent in the market, and the bourgeois culture costumed the model in an extravagance of materialist rewards and crowned its subject with a Darwinian nobility. Under the discursive reign of the world system, or the American or Western story film's narrative structure would dominate world-class cinema for decades. Nonetheless, the style was contrived and not an inevitable construction determined by cinema's capacities. And in the Soviet Union, for one, alternative cinematic styles were being introduced barely a decade later, even before the emergence of a Soviet film culture, when indeed the total annual production of race films exceeded the number of Soviet films. Micheaux had transferred to the screen the polyvocal practices of Black musical aesthetics and speech. There's some good footnotes here too. About Sergei Eisenstein. So one, this is from Rick Altman. Quote, what Eisenstein claimed in a limited context, others have raised to the level of general pronouncement. A fundamental continuity connects the narrative technique of the 19th century realist novel and the dominant style of Hollywood cinema, end quote. And Altman persuasively demonstrates the intervention and stage adaptations as precedents for Griffith and other early filmmakers. The second footnote is James Goodwin asserts that Sergei Eisenstein was not only a major Marxist film artist, but also the first film theorist to analyze the relationship between ideology and filmic forms. Eisenstein opposed positive realism, cause and effect, as a proper filmic narrative, employing in his silent films, for instance, montage and representations of collective heroism as alternative materialist styles and subjects to the classic Hollywood narrative. So I really enjoyed this section. He's bringing in, Sergei Eisenstein, who I know you're also a big fan of, as am I, and talking about Micheaux's work alongside that, which I think is a really good kind of comparison or analogy to bring in, because they both are great. They're both very kind of avant-garde, I guess, in a certain way in some of their work, but meaning they're assailing the dominant ways that the kind of narrative goes on in Hollywood.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could do a whole thing on this for an hour and a half. I mean, this is actually a crux of a huge problem that I have with Robinson's bringing out here with cinematic culture at large. But I'm not the first person to have this challenge, as Robinson is putting out here. There's like a couple strands that you could go. I mean, the idea of the requirement of a singular protagonist whose consciousness gave over and meaning to whatever events were encountered or relationships realized is a fundamental challenge to kind of also just Enlightenment storytelling in general. And there is a sometimes invoked by different people. I feel like filmmaker Raul Ruiz has done this to some degree. Even like Peter Greenaway from England has said these types of things. Eisenstein, of course, originally said, what if film didn't do the singular protagonist thing? Why is that a requirement? How Greenaway goes about it is he says, we make films of illustrated text. So basically, we're basically taking the Western dramatic method and we're just illustrating. We're taking it. We're taking a script and then we're illustrating it on things. And he says, "Why do you need that?" He basically said, "Why do you even need a script? Why can't you just create photos and create relationships via visual cues and things like that?" I mean, he has a great thing with that, and this is kind of in a way, what I have to think what Greenaway wants is actually close to what Micheaux has done with Within Our Gates. And that's why it's such an intervention, because it is counter to what that is. And then Eisenstein with like his film like October, which is to be my favorite of the Eisenstein films. October it totally denies that. What's that line? Collective heroism. That's really what October is about. It's about the collective heroism, so forth and so on. Or films like I Am Cuba is another one, though that kind of does it a little bit. Like I Am Cuba, what like kind of has the singular character, but only in vignettes, and different people did different things with it. But
Yeah.
this is a
Strike
huge conversation.
Strike is another one by
Strike,
Eisenstein. But
Strike's the other one where he goes for that form. And there's a book by a scholar named Todd Cronin called Red Aesthetics, which I read last year. It's about Rodchenko, the photographer, Bertolt Brecht, and Eisenstein, and he uses the three of them. And his main Cronin's main thesis is the problems with empathy in movies. And he talks about how people like Brecht, Rodchenko, and Eisenstein, not just movies, but in arts that are meant to be liberatory, but that empathy actually might be causing us more problems. And that's where I was talking about the kind of the distancing of Within Our Gates, being able to look back, which is very Brechtian, but this is actually like right around Brecht. It's interesting, the overlaps of time. I mean, Micheaux, the more we talk about it, the more Micheaux becomes a very, very, and this film becomes a very significant work, beyond just, it was the first Black movie. But yeah, I could go on for days about this. There's a lot in this, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds of it, but there's a lot here. And I'm glad Robinson is invoking this, because it is true. The Western way is a way that was implanted on film. It's not native. It's only native because that's what they said we have to do.
Yeah. So he goes from here into like a pretty lengthy plot synopsis of the film, which we're not going to go through all of that. I suggest people watch it and you will see. Are there points that you want to bring out? I rewatched it. I know you did, about particular either plot elements, subversions, or just technical things that are going on in the film that you would want to speak about.
I mean, I talked a little bit about the technical stuff on my own just now. I'm trying to think. Do you have anything or no?
A couple. I mean,
Yeah, jump one, and then I'll do one right after you. So I just want to
yeah.
get it
So
up.
I mean, a few that stand out. The preacher scene that you talk about, we could say a little bit more about that if you want to. Obviously, there's this whole there's a So I'll read this, which kind of summarize it, but it says employing a flashback device, Micheaux constructs Sylvia's hitherto hidden past, the legitimate. I should say in the beginning, there's this scene where I think it's Sylvia who is seen with a white man by somebody who is like sort of a suitor, um and it's believed that like there can't possibly be a good explanation for this, right? Like she must be in some sort of relationship with this white man. um so that's context, but it's just shown for like a moment early in the film, and you don't really know like what's going on there or what that's about at all. And then much later you get this is where he's kind of talking to about this is a technique of Micheaux, to kind of have this film weave through all the way, and then at the end you get this like kind of big. Gosh, I don't know if I wanna say this because then it's gonna, like, like, I'm, like, spoiling it for people who
No,
haven't
I
seen it.
wouldn't. They should
Okay,
watch that. Yeah, they should watch it. I
okay,
know I
okay,
really do encourage people to watch it. I was wondering,
yeah,
Criterion Channel actually had it and they had a soundtrack, but I think they took it down.
uh
So with the
you might be able
soundtrack.
to find check
And
it out. So I put one link on in the show description, which is the Library of Congress version, which does not have a soundtrack. You might be able to find if you look at it on YouTube versions where a soundtrack is added because it's all public domain at this point. This film's,
yeah.
over 100 years old. Um, the thing that I would somebody asked a question. I don't really have an answer to this soundtrack stand-ins. I mean, it's hard because like with film, you need like different songs in different elements of
Yeah.
the film to kind of pull out the mood. And so you really need somebody who's like an accomplished, like at least pianist at kind of creating the music for each segment, which is also, yeah, I mean, it kind of connects to what he was talking about too with the relationship between jazz and film in this era. So yeah, I'm not gonna go into it. I guess what I would say is that there are a number of ways that the tropes and the characters that are set up in Birth of a Nation, um, they definitely reemerge, and there's very clear kind of. It's not as though he's exactly reproducing it, but it's very clear that he's responding to certain things, and he's responding to themes around representations of mixed race folks. He's responding to how folks become mixed race predominantly within
Mhm.
US history, historically, especially in this period. He's responding to, um, also he does some really cool stuff around newspaper titles and, um, the way that the media. Robinson actually talks about that, about how, newspaper is supposed to be the first draft of history, but Micheaux is also showing that newspapers are used very propagandistically, in the film to get people to read like lynchings and different criminal things in a certain way, that really absolves, of course, white supremacy. Um, so those are some of the things, and then yeah, I mean, I do think we could talk about the preacher scene because that doesn't really spoil anything. It's kind of a
Yeah.
minor scene, but it's an important one.
Yeah. I mean, we could even show a piece of it.
Sure.
Maybe like show like a quick piece of it.
Do you
And
have
why
a timestamp or whatever?
I literally had it. Let me go find it. Shoot. Yeah, it's where does it start? It starts at 30. Do you have the film up?
It's
I'll
you're
send it
using
to you
the
right now.
Library of Congress one. Yeah,
Yep.
you could send it in the private chat actually.
Yeah, I'll do it right now. Let me share. Um, boom. And that should be, did I do it with the, no, I didn't. Hold on. Do it with the time on it. It should be with the time on it. If it's not, it's 32:55.
All right. Yeah, that should be the time on it. Okay. Looks like it. All right. All right. Let's see. Let's get us out of the way so y'all can watch it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we could probably
Yeah,
stop
stop
there,
there.
right? And we
Yeah,
can summarize some of the stuff that goes on
yeah.
afterwards. But like, so he also, and yeah, well, you can if you want to say anything about that.
Well,
Say,
I think some of what it's funny watching it again. Like I can see where Robinson would think about the jazz element of the well. He also talks about spirituals.
mhm.
And this the part where is this? I can't remember where he talks about how spiritual had a dominant form in or was that in a previous chapter? I think it's in a
No, he
previous
does.
chapter.
He does go in that here too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he talks about that in the dominance of spirituals and the kind of the call and the response, and you can see in the imagery with the use of the juxtaposition of the imagery of going from the title card, but also how he ranges out to the audiences. So one person silently in frame, but then gives you a different frame of like the rise up. But Micheaux is like he has like to me a levity that like the 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 costumes, the makeups, the beards, they're, granted no one had complex wigs at the time, but I think he knows that and he's using it and he's playing it up, you
It's
know.
interesting because it's not that way. Like that scene in particular, it stands out to you when you look at them. Like there's like a
Right.
very comedic, like you look
Yeah.
really goofy with these like wigs on
Exactly.
and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas like a lot of them, the characters are just playing it, pretty much straight, like with without much
And that's the thing.
costuming or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of contrapuntal. Like it's not the film, and that's what I think Robinson's talking about. If you watch the rest of the film, which has these kind of dramatic elements, and he talks about that a little bit in the book, how he'll go from drama to this to that, which I think is probably why he's getting a jazz, um, connection parallel because of jazz's ability to go from da 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 right, and then go there. So I can see where he's going with that for it, but it's it shows Micheaux's also kind of I also take it, and I think there's always been a thing of debate, and Robinson doesn't get into the debate too heavily of how much within our gates is a direct response to Birth of a Nation. Like there's people who historicized it was like a direct response. Robinson doesn't really weigh into that too much. I don't. It's not that interesting. He does make it like it's aware.
Yeah. I mean, he does talk about elements of it, definitely
Right.
responding to direct elements
And
in
that's kind of
Birth
what
of a
I'm saying.
Nation.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Like there's like these elemental things. So I think there's a way of like you caricatured us with the blackface. So I'm still gonna do a bit of a caricature, but I'm gonna show you like expressionistic character done correctly. How to actually do an expressionistic version of a human being in a way that has a tastefulness and actually expressing something that isn't racist ideology.
Right. Well, I think the other thing that's interesting, right, is that the figures that he treats this way are the collaborators with
Yep.
white supremacy ultimately, right? So, like, we
Mm,
didn't see that in this scene. I mean, you could see the ways that this guy's kind of conniving and, like, he's definitely, but like the flip is there's like a scene after this where he's meeting with like these, rich white folks or whatever, and like he basically, I'm trying to remember the exact thing, but I think he supports like voter disenfranchisement or something like that. Like, so he like totally, and he recognizes even as he's walking out of it, like that I'm going to hell basically for what
yeah.
I'm doing. Um, so the preacher, and then there's like another figure that's like a snitch character, like who almost looks the same. Like I don't even know if it's the same actor or whatever, but like um there's like, yeah, the figures that I would say are more, kind of where he's, like, sort of poking fun at that, or, like, they're melodramatic, I guess you could say, in their representation of them,
Mhm.
are the ones that are villains in a certain respect, and they're villains not because they're, like, doing, uh they're not punching down. They're like they're not like punching up. They're
Mhm.
collaborators
Yeah.
basically, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Which is a theme for Micheaux. I mean, his other film, Body and Soul, you see that as well. Like the person in positions of power who basically sell, black people down the river. Is a thing for Micheaux. It's an interest for him as a filmmaker.
yeah, and he counterposes that with other characters that are genuinely
Yeah.
like there for like working class black people.
Yep.
And so yeah,
Yeah.
which is a very very different than you know, I mean any of the other you know kind of films
Hmm.
of the time. Let's see, there's one point I want to bring up towards the end that I found end of this section is he says
Hmm.
neither Griffith's ending nor Michaud's ending can trump the enduring impact of the images of violence and hatred which preceded them.
Yeah.
Happy endings, bourgeois couplings are fake resolutions, an escapist fantasy lacking even the imaginative power to will away the horrific sights and sounds emanating from a society engaged in racial conflict. So I just thought that was an important point too, again, as we talk about like where does Robinson sit on like what constitutes resistance and he is quite clear that like this, as great as it is not going to like the revolution doesn't come from a film like this.
Yeah.
And also that even Griffith's thing like is not going to trump like all of the other the lynchings and everything else that's going on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, but and I think also he's also there is that materially, but also like he also has a bit of a criticism, and I don't want to get too much into it. As I like people to watch the film of the ending of the film in itself. Also, there is a criticism of it, which I share. I share with him, though I do get Michelle's intentions, but I think as it goes, um,
Yeah, and he has some other critiques of Micheaux too
yeah,
around like his like colorism and like an interesting he digs into a part of the like the black petite bourgeoisie and
mm-hmm,
this idea that also that mixed race people represented a superior race themselves,
yep,
right? That they were
he
better than
definitely,
both white and black people.
yeah,
And he doesn't go, you know, he doesn't like put that fully on Micheaux, but he does sort of say like, you could read his work that it's a conclusion that you might draw like looking at this and analyzing it as to
mm-hmm,
why the light-skinned black figures are kind of always the heroes and the positive characters within his work, and it's darker skinned figures that
right.
are more often not.
Yeah, and he gets into like he kind of tries to tie it to the discussion. I don't know what Robinson's final conclusion. I don't think he has a necessarily final conclusion on this, but the idea of the denigration of the mixed race person, them needing a kind of uplift. So that was part of the reason why he would put them in these positions as a response. But in that response, he also had other characters who were in these positions of being,
Yeah.
not the best.
So I don't think. I mean, is there's anything else you want to say about within our
The
gates or that?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is like the end of this section before we get to maybe not within our gates, probably just like a couple of these lines about where he talks about Michaud's form and how it informs things later. That's pretty. I can step into that. Is that where you wanted to go?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time with
Yeah,
because we have with
yeah,
Dash and M Night Shyamalan. I think it's interesting he pulls them in, but yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
I mean, the only thing he brings in Tony K. Bambara, which is just awesome. But one of the things he brings in from Tony K. Bambara is her insistence that Hollywood filmmaking is tyrannical, right? And she does that in explaining like Daughters of the Dust and Robinson brings Daughters in the Dust in as a kind of somewhat heir to Micheaux. Like, he doesn't say like direct, like they were working with, though. I think of all the people he cites, Dash would have definitely been the most aware of that work. I don't know about Shyamalan or others, but definitely Dash. But he also he connects, because she does say this. Dash appropriates Jiga Vertov's stuff and about eliminating bourgeois narrative structure, and in a way, Robinson is actually connecting. I think is trying to connect Micheaux to Vertov by doing that. But he talks about, how when Dash made Daughters of the Dust, and he goes into like a kind of style of it and how it's done. I don't want to get into that. By creating these kind of like unrelated, kind of scattered bits and kind of like changing the representation. The representation, the spectator tip participation, right? And breaking the bourgeois narrative structure. And I thought that was really powerful, because when I watched Within Our Gates, I was reminded that. And that's interesting because it's a film about a class of Black people. So Micheaux, and it shows how wise he was in needing to attack the people who were trying to denigrate that. He had to also break bourgeois structure. It couldn't just be, I'm going to make them look better under melodrama. I have to also attack how you do it. So it just shows more of his wisdom. And by doing that, he also shows, because one of the things that happened with Micheaux later that Robinson gets into briefly is he ended up making more conventional films. So you see kind of what tyranny then later did, the tyranny of Hollywood of American film culture does to Micheaux in the end.
Yeah, he said, I'll just read this quote quickly. He says, his silent films were more complex than his later films precisely because their production costs were sufficiently modest to permit his dependence on the Black community. That's another thing he talked about that we didn't talk about, was just how, all the creative ways that Micheaux used the Black community in the creation of his films, and also to save money. But it says the higher production cost demands of sound films and the subsequent enlistment of non-Black capital by Micheaux led to his abandoning his political films. From the early 1930s on, Micheaux would seek to emulate, that is, transfer to his Black audiences, the genre and narrative formulas prescribed in the Hollywood studio system. So it's an important point too. Again, like, appreciate about Robinson always, like he has like all these parts where he wants to talk about aspects that are like great, and I think he thinks even kind of revolutionary in certain respects, to then also be like, well, ultimately, but again, like you said, it's more of a critique of the system and the way that it kind of grinds you. And if you are gonna keep up with it and actually be able to make things within the more dominant forms, then you have to kind of fit into that system.
Yeah. So he does a thing that, like, I agree with him on Dash. I don't agree with him on M. Night Shyamalan at all. Because he quotes Bombara and saying that we need a kind of a democratic cinema, right? And I take that as I need to actually go and I've read that essay where it's from, but I wasn't able to reread it before. But right, I'll read this little part. In the compelling need for meaning and the habituation of the film experiences, audiences will grasp at each narrative fragment in a succession of meaning rewards, as if this were surely what the filmmaker once privileged. Bombara has asserted that this maneuver constitutes a foundation for democratic cinema. So it's kind of about breaking the strict dictatorial structures of Western cinema or Hollywood cinema or dominant cinema, however you want, and creating a kind of different visual palette so it could be more democratic. It's something that Vertov had theorized. If you ever see Man with a Movie Camera, that's kind of like his whole thing of like the succession of images. and then Micheaux, I can see being the tradition, the dash, and that kind of opening of that. I don't agree with M. Night Shyamalan because that is a narrative device that I think is actually a lot older in movie making that he's invoking. He's talking about the Sixth Sense. And if you've seen the Sixth Sense, we don't get into the plot of it, but the kind of subversion of it. I don't really see how that fits. I think he's being way too generous
Yeah.
to
He
Shyamalan
talks
there.
about Unbreakable as well. Those two
Unbreakable,
films.
right.
Yeah.
That's the other film. I think he's being way too generous. That to me is a trick, not a structure. If there's a filmmakers that maybe could get closer to that in Hollywood, there probably have been. I don't want to go into my brain into that. I have to think about this out of respect for what's being talked about here. I wouldn't want to say anyone loosely, but
Yeah.
I do think if taking M. Night Shyamalan out of it, I do think what he's saying here is really good, right? The Hollywood classic narrative functions as a form of tyranny. It lulls active intelligence into the forfeiture of critical or independent thought by costuming all lived reality into the boundaries of closed narratives. Right. And that's a big problem and a big thing that's been positive about not even just American film, but dramatic arts. I mean, that was Brecht's issue. That was when Baraka finished Dutchman and he went into doing his stuff in Harlem, plays like The Slave Ship and things like that. That's something that he posited as well. Black Arts Movement shows, people like Ed Bullins and things like that. And actually, I will give a film that I'm actually a little surprised, but I'd be curious of what Robin thought. I think Killer of Sheep by Charles Burnett would actually fall better than that in my Shyamalan. Killer of Sheep would actually fall within it perfectly. Or Ashes and Embers by Holly Garima, I think also falls. But then, I mean, they're in the same collective as Dash, so it would make sense that they would kind of share a similar thing. But I thought that was a great part. I mean, there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
We could go through it, but there's a lot in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the yeah, I found it a little interesting that he pulled in Shyamalan, and I think partly it was probably trying to take a reference point that would be, more that more people would have some access to,
Yeah.
because more people have seen Sixth Sense or Unbreakable for sure. They were huge films. I mean, Sixth Sense won Oscars,
Yeah, it's huge. That was a mega film.
that and it I mean, it is true in some respects that when those films, especially when Sixth Sense, Unbreakable was not that critically acclaimed, but that people really did think of it as like, wow, this is something, kind of different. But I agree. I mean, I actually have always felt like Hitchcock even is like a big kind of antecedent of a lot of Shyamalan stuff.
Well,
But
100%.
yeah. But anyway, it nonetheless, I mean, it's interesting, and it's interesting the way he talks about it and all of that. And the way part of what he's also talking about is just this idea that you would like plant a seed very early on in a film, which Micheaux
Mhm.
does, and that this would bear fruit to like a big kind of shift in, like everything that I thought was going on here
Mhm.
is like not what actually is going on.
Mhm.
So that device, I think, is partly what he's
Mhm.
referencing within the film. Um, yeah, there's a lot here. Again, we've been going for a while, so I
Yeah.
think we should start to wind down. But
Yeah.
yeah, you talked about the Hollywood thing and all of that.
Yeah. Go ahead. You can
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, like the
Yeah,
last
I
part,
was gonna
the
jump
end.
ahead, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna go to that, like to the end of the beginning section where
Yeah,
he
let's do
says,
that.
"Yeah,
Yep.
yeah." So, like, I'm just gonna read this part here. I'll stop before the Willy Wonka thing, but this is great, right? To see Micheaux and other independent filmmakers of race movies as a raid against Hollywood is an understandable error. It is and he puts Hollywood in quotations also. It is an erroneous claim since it begs the question of its premise. What does one signify by the term Hollywood? Something called Hollywood has existed in the imaginaries of film historians for several decades, consequently haunting cultural authorities. A self-standing, self-sufficient enterprise, Hollywood has seldom been analyzed outside the boundaries of the industrial typography invented to sustain the illusion. Unlike other corporate apparatuses or commercial complexes, early and later, Hollywood has often been treated as if it stood in magnificent isolation from the humdrum practices or interests of American capitalism. Look, what Robinson says very beautifully there is like, I think every argument that every radical revolutionary filmmaker has been trying to make for as long as there been a mass produced amount of movies coming out of the United States, right? It is like, it is this idea that you could separate this thing from the capitalist project of America is absolutely, or, everything from as reductive as, well, it's just a movie, right? That's like the most like, or come on, I know that the CIA, may give money, but look, it doesn't really matter, right? And the various graphs of this thing. But what he's expressing here is really important, and I think, because the it is a large enterprise, and what I think would probably one of the most important things Robinson is doing in this book to me is showing that the enterprise has always been about American capital, and of course continues to be. I'm sure he would not say it's any different in that way, just differently formed. But I think that's like the important intervention. He's showing you how it grew, and it grew within, alongside, and part of doing the bidding of capitalism.
Yeah, the next part is funny to me too. I mean, like
The
Willy
Willy Wonka.
Wonka's chocolate factory, Hollywood commerce is supposedly transparent. Capital accumulation and risk capital, and he does this like he's like creating this little equation, like goes into movie production, goes into box office profits, and so on. And inside the box, that is the studios, where commodities, movies, are produced according to this model, bosses manage capital and mold artists and technicians into formidable combinations of cultural production. This fabulous imaginary process strips capital of every competence and every motivation except that of greed, capital accumulation. It also entirely misconstrues the film industry. Douglas Gomery observes that in the 1930s and 1940s, at the height of the studio system, production 5% and distribution 1% accounted for 6% of the total assets of the studios. Exhibition, ownership of movie houses, accounted for the rest. It says then he goes on to say the amount of capital required for production paled when compared to the cost of financing a chain of several hundred movie theaters. In short, real estate was the predominant form of capital in the golden age of the movie industry. Few film historians, however, find it appropriate to interrogate the implications for movie production beyond the organizational structure of the studios, the eccentricities of studio heads, the prominence and successes of certain genres, and contributions of creative arts. So, yeah, I mean, then it talks about film scholars can live with this conceit as long as their herd remains in step. But few inside the production process can afford such naivety. From the onset of motion picture exhibition, there's been the persistent need to reckon with what it is that capital requires of the industry and how to deliver it. I'll stop there. But yeah,
But that
goes into a bunch of
that
people.
and that last sentence is why film is such a crisis. I mean, no one wants to really have that conversation. Like there is a la land, pun intended, that people live in about the movie industry, who work within it or who cover it. It's pretty frustrating in that there is no real conversations, and they don't. I mean, because like even I think the real estate point is also very strong, because if you think about actually the big movie closures in the 60s that created what we now know as the new 70s cinema, right? That had a lot to do with the studios not being able to afford that whole structure couldn't function anymore, right? So they had to do a restructuring of everything. So shooting films in different areas and so forth and so on. So it's like they had this one model that was very much about the studio rents and the things that they did in the real estate that they were able to capture in Los Angeles. But then it actually is kind of going back to it. Then it went back to that in the 90s when they went to like different places. And you know, you got areas in like the South and where they have big lots, and they had it in Canada for a while. It's always moving and shifting. It's a constant, you know, I mean, the movie business is very much like a nation in itself. It's like it likes to like go somewhere, colonize an area, take it over, suck all its resources out, have people come in, and then, you know, when they're like, all right, we're closing shop, get the fuck out, and everyone's suffering, right? You know, it's a very pernicious thing, but it's about capital, right? It is always about capital, right?
I don't know if there's other parts. I'll just read this last section here, and then
Yeah,
if you
that's
want to
it.
jump back and include anything else, it
Mhm.
says Micheaux's filmmaking, however, could not surmount the powerful forces mobbing against Black film or the extraordinary changes in movie making. As spokespersons for an uplift social program, Black newspapers were fitful in their support of his silent films. And then came the talkies and the Great Depression. With respect to these two occurrences, there were evidence of profound changes in the American economy and the capitalist world system, and the impact they were to have on representation of blacks in American movies might make even the most accommodating of black middle class nostalgic for Micheaux's infractions. So that's where we close. I don't know if there was anything else in that section you wanted to highlight.
No, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff in here, but I
There
think we
is.
can begin to close it up. I mean, this section is really it was really strong. And I'm actually very curious as where he goes. Honestly, now
Yeah.
this is actually the most like, okay, I'm actually curious how you're gonna wrap this up now, you
Yeah, the
know?
last chapter is called The Racial Regimes of the Golden Age, which, yeah, it will be very
Oh,
interesting.
interesting, very interesting. And then because
Um,
then he ends there, which is very interesting. Okay.
yeah. The only other thing I'll just point is he did say, with the exception of comedies, race movies were seldom exhibited to non-black audiences. Jim Crow effectively quarantined black subversions of screened minstrelsy and was complemented by the commercial exigencies of mass entertainment. And on the other side of race segregation, the accommodationists among black middle class patrolled the black lower classes and race movies for signs of rebelliousness. When black nationalism, black radicalism, black resistance, or black insurgencies did erupt, they were either absent or caricatured in race movies.
Yeah.
So and he says black melodramas might employ reference to the social ideology of Booker T. Washington, but with respect to the Niagara movement, the NAACP, Black Socialism, the the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which is Garvey's organization, or black resistance to lynching, there was almost total silence. And then he says, Oscar Micheaux was the anomaly in
Anomaly.
that mix. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Which, yeah, thank you for bringing that one back. I, I, this is something maybe on our last talk on this. I found that very interesting, just in terms of the historiography of Black cinema developing more radical tones, and then thinking about who was it? Lot's. I think it was Lot's kind of graph of what
yeah, it was.
would be a black what would constitute black cinema. I find this is just an interesting fact because this seems to bake in, I think, a long attitude towards what should be included within black film. Because, like, even now, when you have black nationalism, or black radicalism employed in movies often, especially popular movies. The national, I think of I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, when he goes and he sees like Clarence Williams III. He has like the white wife and father, oh great black king. That whole part, the kind of he's the joke, right? or you
Or
could
like
go
CB4 with the
I'm
yeah.
black, right? Exactly. He's so overtly angry, or Black Panther, right? Like Killmonger, he has this assessment of history, but he is crazy. He shoots a black woman, and and he's so bad that T'Challa has to go work with the CIA to get him killed. Which is just wild. That will always be the wildest thing to me in a movie. The CIA is better than this dude, right? But also, he wants to destroy Africa. The American-born black dude wants to obliterate Africa from the world. So I find that interesting as a baked in thing, because I've always said that. I've said this before. I was like, you can't have super radical characters. I mean, like, in the Fred Hampton movie, when he just dies, he gets killed, right? It's a thing. A radical that they're fine with being in a film is one who gets, is one who dies, right? And fixing his story to his death and to his murder and his assassination, right? And to the people who did it, rather than some kind of other thought. And I found that section very interesting. And I feel like Robinson actually would agree with me here. I think he would agree with me here that this tradition, it has stayed with us forever, right? And it's been stamped in, right? And because it's not just white people also who will deny that. It'll also be black people within that structure who want to maintain their status within the racial regime.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things that he's showing in this chapter is that the role for the black middle class, so long as they play that role within the structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So long as they are going to police the bounds and the radicalism among the black masses,
Yeah.
and the whatever, like the backwards, like whatever, these racist ideas, right? Of whether it's loafers or all of these things, like that, it's either a kind of moral policing, right, or it's like
Yeah.
a political policing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, that's the role. And you're right. I mean, often I like, I like really bad films and television sometimes, just so I can like root for the
Mm-hmm.
villain, right? Like that's like the
Right. And you're first to do like a subversion, but then even that doesn't feel like. I remember when people were doing like the Killmonger was right thing. And I was
right.
like, I was totally like, I got the need, but I was like, yeah, but he's such a caricature. Like,
Yeah.
he's such a disrespect to the
Yeah.
revolutionary that, like, I can't. I get why y'all want to do that. I just can't go there. I have to just say,
Yeah.
no, Black Panther, the movie is wrong
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, I had issues with that as well for all the reasons you laid out, which is like, but I think it was Musa Springer who pointed out, and I think I disagreed with him at the time, but I think ultimately they were right, which is just that is the trope, like that the reason to, I guess, side with Killmonger is to understand that Killmonger is a deliberate misrepresentation, right?
Right.
And so
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem
Yeah.
because it's like that is what people then do, is they say, well, like, you don't want communism. You're gonna have, you're gonna murder 200 million
The
people. Like,
people, right? Exactly. Right. They're gonna blow up Wakanda, man. Like, you can't have that. You don't want these things, and it becomes too much for me to deal with. I can't.
yeah.
For me, like, if people want to do it that way, it's totally fine. But I'd rather just not participate at all.
Yeah. No, I kind of am in the same boat on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. There's like also, for me, there's like the difference between like the guilty pleasure and the like what I'm gonna go out and go to
One hundred
bat for
percent.
as a public intellectual.
100%. Oh, 100%. Yeah, you're gonna really put your whole thing on this thing, and you're like, nah, man, I ain't doing that one. But yeah, I went and saw Blade and had a good time. Like, it was fun.
Yeah.
Even though I could
Yeah.
recognize some weird things within it, but totally, yeah. But Yeah.
Yeah. All right, this was
All right,
great.
man.
But yeah,
Yes.
we gotta set it up. Hopefully, fingers crossed, I'll be back in my studio the next time we do this, but I'm not positive on that.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, maybe we'll do it next weekend. I'm not. We'll figure that out and let
Yeah.
everybody know.
Yeah.
This was great. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks
Yes.
again, man. Have a good week,
Yeah.
and
Peace.
thanks everybody for tuning in.